My husband texted me. I am in a meeting. Happy 10th wedding anniversary, babe. But I was sitting exactly 2 tables away watching him passionately kiss another woman who just so happened to be my best friend. Just as I gripped my wine glass ready to scorch the earth and confront them publicly, a sharp-dressed stranger slid past my table, dropped a folded cocktail napkin, and whispered to stay calm because the real show was about to begin. What I saw next made my blood run cold and changed my life forever. If you have ever had your entire reality shattered by the people you trusted most, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I took back my empire. My name is Serena. I am 34 years old, and I operate in the upper echelons of Buckhead in Atlanta as a financial technology chief executive officer. I built my company from the ground up, writing code in cramped apartments and pitching to investors who never expected a young black woman to outsmart them at their own game. Over the past decade, I have quietly amassed a massive real estate portfolio and a tech empire that firmly establishes my place in Atlanta's elite circles. I prefer to stay out of the spotlight. I let my husband Derek play the role of the high-earning provider while I pull the strings and fund our lifestyle from the shadows. Tonight was supposed to be our 10th wedding anniversary. I had arrived early at the Capitol Grill, one of the most exclusive and dimly lit restaurants in Buckhead. I wore a stunning emerald green silk dress, with my hair perfectly styled, ready to celebrate a decade of what I believed was a rock-solid marriage. The maitre d' had seated me in a private alcove, a secluded spot draped in shadows that offered a perfect view of the main dining floor, while keeping me completely hidden from the rest of the room. I ordered a glass of vintage Cabernet and checked my phone. The screen lit up with a message from Derek. The text read, "Board meeting is dragging. Happy 10th anniversary, my queen. Love you. I will be home as soon as I can." A soft smile touched my lips. Derek was a director at a prominent investment fund, and late nights were part of the territory. I typed out a quick understanding reply, telling him not to worry, and that I would keep his dinner warm. I set my phone down on the pristine white tablecloth and took a slow sip of my wine, letting my gaze drift across the restaurant, enjoying the low hum of jazz and the smell of seared steak filling the room. That is when the air completely left my lungs. Exactly 2 tables away, sitting in a plush leather booth, was Derek. He was not in a board meeting. He was not reviewing financial portfolios or negotiating corporate mergers. He was leaning across the table with his hand resting intimately on the cheek of a beautiful woman. They were kissing. It was not a friendly peck or a casual greeting. It was the kind of deep, passionate kiss that spoke of long-standing familiarity and shared secrets. My heart slammed against my ribs. I blinked hard, praying the dim lighting was playing cruel tricks on my eyes. But as they pulled apart and the woman tilted her head back to laugh at something Derek said, the ambient light caught her face perfectly. It was Camille. Camille was my best friend. We had met on our very first day at our historically black college. We had shared dorm rooms, navigated the brutal world of early adulthood together, and promised to always have each other's backs, no matter what happened. She was my maid of honor when I married Derek. She knew my deepest fears, my biggest insecurities, and the intricate details of my daily life. Seeing her sitting there with my husband felt like the floor had suddenly evaporated beneath my feet. I felt a physical sickness wash over me. My mind raced through the past year, trying to connect the dots. The late-night phone calls Camille claimed were about her difficult boss. The weekend retreats Derek said were mandatory for his firm. The times they had both conveniently been unavailable on the exact same days. How had I been so blind? How had the 2 people I trusted most in the world managed to orchestrate this ultimate betrayal right under my nose while looking me in the eye every single day? But the initial shock of the affair was quickly eclipsed by a detail that made my blood run absolute ice. As Camille leaned forward to clink her champagne glass against Derek's, the chandelier light caught the brilliant sparkle of the jewelry resting against her collarbone. It was a custom-designed diamond necklace, my necklace. I had purchased that piece for $45,000 to celebrate my company hitting its first major valuation milestone. It was a one-of-a-kind creation featuring a distinctive teardrop diamond surrounded by a halo of rare blue sapphires. I loved that necklace. But exactly 1 month ago, Derek had come to me in a panic, claiming he had accidentally left the wall safe open and the house had been burglarized while I was away on a business trip. He even filed a police report and spent weeks comforting me over the loss of my prized possession, telling me it was just a material thing and that my safety was what truly mattered. Now that very same necklace was draped around my best friend's neck, glittering mockingly in the restaurant's ambient light. The audacity of it was paralyzing. Derek had stolen my property, lied to my face, filed a fraudulent police report, and gifted my $45,000 milestone reward to his mistress. And Camille, the woman who had cried with me over the phone when I told her about the burglary, was wearing it proudly in public without a single ounce of shame. The sheer disrespect ignited a fire inside me that quickly burned away the heartbreak. I was not a fragile, helpless woman who would crumble into tears. I was a chief executive who had survived vicious corporate battles and ruthless negotiations. I felt my hand wrapped tightly around the stem of my wine glass. My knuckles turned white. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up, march over to their table, and smash the red wine directly into their deceitful, smiling faces. I wanted to tear that necklace off Camille and watch Derek scramble to explain himself in front of the entire Buckhead elite. I was ready to scorch the earth and leave nothing but ashes behind. I took a deep breath with my muscles tense like a coiled spring ready to unleash a decade of suppressed fury. I shifted my weight to the edge of the velvet booth, keeping my eyes locked on Derek's smug face as he whispered something into Camille's ear. I was half a second away from becoming the biggest scandal this restaurant had ever seen. Before I could even lift myself from the seat, a shadow fell across my table. A tall, impeccably dressed man slid smoothly into the space beside my booth, moving with a quiet, lethal grace that demanded immediate attention. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit that screamed old money and calculated power. He appeared to be in his early 40s with sharp, observant eyes that seemed to process everything in the room simultaneously. He did not look directly at me. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, pretending to wait for the maitre d'. But as he stood there, his hand brushed the edge of my table, and a small folded cocktail napkin slid across the white linen, stopping right next to my wine glass. "Stay calm," the man whispered, his voice so low and steady it barely carried over the ambient jazz music playing in the background. "The affair is just amateur hour. Watch the red folder." Before I could even process his words, the stranger smoothly turned on his heel and walked toward the private dining rooms in the back, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had arrived. I sat frozen, staring at the napkin. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins suddenly turned icy. The stranger's voice had carried absolute authority, representing the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing secrets that others would kill to hide. I slowly unfolded the napkin. There was nothing written on the inside. The message had only been verbal, acting as a ghost of a warning. I forced myself to lean back into the deep shadows of my alcove, taking a slow, steadying breath. I pulled my phone from my clutch, switching it to silent mode, and opened the camera application. I zoomed in on Derek and Camille's table, hitting the record button while keeping my hands perfectly still. For a few minutes, it was just more of the same sickening display. They fed each other bites of expensive steak, laughed, and touched hands. I watched them through the screen of my phone, forcing myself to detach my emotions from the situation. I had to view this not as a betrayed wife, but as a chief executive assessing a hostile corporate takeover. Then the dynamic at their table shifted. The playful romance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, intense seriousness. Derek reached down to his designer leather briefcase resting on the floor. He pulled out a thick, heavy document folder. It was bright red, standing out vividly against the muted tones of the restaurant, exactly as the stranger had predicted. My heart began to hammer a new, terrifying rhythm against my chest. The stranger was right. This was not an anniversary gift. It was not a menu or a travel brochure for a romantic getaway. Derek laid the red folder flat on the table, pushing aside the bread plates and water glasses to make room. He opened it, and Camille leaned in close with her eyes scanning the dense stacks of legal paper inside. Through the zoom lens of my phone, the high-resolution camera picked up the bold capitalized headings of the documents. My breath hitched in my throat as the words came into focus. The first document was a warranty deed. It was the official property transfer paperwork for my estate at Alto Lake. The lake house was my sanctuary, representing a magnificent $4.5 million property featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a private dock, and acres of pristine woodland. I had purchased it entirely with my own money through a private limited liability company to keep it out of the public eye and separate from our marital assets. Derek had always complained that my financial boundaries were a sign I did not trust him. Now I knew exactly why those boundaries were absolutely necessary. I zoomed in closer, feeling my hands starting to tremble as I read the names on the document. The grantor listed was my holding company. The grantee, representing the new sole owner of my $4.5 million sanctuary, was listed as Camille. I felt a wave of pure nausea. Derek was not just cheating on me. He was actively attempting to steal my real estate and give it to his mistress. But the true horror was yet to come. Camille flipped to the next page in the red folder. The heading read, Irrevocable Transfer of Equity and Intellectual Property. Below it were the details of my financial technology company. The company I had bled for, representing the empire I had built through years of grueling 80-hour work weeks, sacrificed sleep, and relentless dedication. The documents outlined a transfer of a massive controlling chunk of my founder's equity directly into an offshore trust managed by Derek's investment fund. I stared at the screen while my mind struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of the fraud happening right in front of me. To execute documents of this magnitude, Derek would need extensive legal notarization, corporate seals, and most importantly, my signature. As Camille turned the final page, the camera captured the bottom of the document. There, resting on the signature line, was my name. It was signed in blue ink, looping and precise, acting as a perfect, flawless replica of my personal signature. The reality of the situation hit me with the force of a freight train. Derek had meticulously forged my signature on incredibly complex legal and financial documents. He had somehow bypassed my corporate security protocols, likely exploiting his status as my husband to gain access to my notary stamps and digital identity files. He was systematically dismantling my life, preparing to strip me of my wealth, my property, and my company, leaving me with absolutely nothing. And he was doing it all while texting me happy anniversary. The affair was indeed just amateur hour. This was a calculated, cold-blooded financial assassination. Derek and Camille were not just two people caught up in a forbidden romance. They were conspirators in a massive multi-million-dollar fraud scheme designed to completely destroy my existence. I lowered my phone, making sure the video file was safely saved and backed up to my secure cloud server. The urge to confront them was completely gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. Throwing wine in their faces would only tip them off. It would give Derek the chance to destroy the evidence, to spin the narrative, and to use his connections in the investment world to cover his tracks. If I reacted now, I would lose everything. I sat in the dark alcove of the Capitol Grill, watching my husband and my best friend clink their glasses over the successful theft of my life's work. They thought they had won. They thought I was the clueless, trusting wife sitting at home waiting to serve dinner to her hardworking husband. They had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I picked up my purse, dropped $100 bill on the table to cover my wine, and quietly slipped out the side exit of the restaurant. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury for people who had time to waste. I had an empire to protect, a fraud to uncover, and a devastating counterstrike to plan. The war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure that Derek and Camille would regret the day they ever decided to cross me. The valet brought my car around to the front of the restaurant. I handed him a crisp $50 bill slipped behind the wheel of my custom matte black Mercedes Maybach and pulled out onto Peachtree Road. The vibrant city lights of Buckhead blurred past my tinted windows, illuminating the sleek leather interior of the cabin. Inside the car, the silence was absolute. My heart rate, which had been hammering against my ribs just minutes earlier, had finally settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm. The initial shock of seeing Derek's hands all over Camille had burned away completely, leaving behind a frozen wasteland of pure strategic calculation. I gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling the smooth texture under my palms. My phone connected to the car's Bluetooth system, and the dashboard screen instantly lit up with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed Vivian, my mother-in-law. Any normal mother-in-law calling her son's wife on the night of their 10th wedding anniversary would be calling to offer warm congratulations. She would ask what restaurant we chose or send blessings for another decade of love and prosperity. But Vivian was not a normal mother-in-law. Vivian was a woman who wore her high society status like a loaded weapon. She was a prominent figure in the upper echelons of Atlanta's black elite, a woman obsessed with galas, country clubs, and preserving the flawless image of the family name. I tapped the screen to answer the call, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Serena. I am hosting my sorority sisters and the pastor's family at the Alto Lake Mansion this weekend, Vivian announced. Her voice boomed through the car speakers, sharp and commanding, devoid of any basic pleasantries. There was no greeting. There was no anniversary wish. There was only the immediate expectation of my absolute compliance. Move your things out of the master suite for Terrence and his new girlfriend Vivian, continued dictating her orders with the breezy arrogance of a queen addressing a maid. You and Derek take the guest room down the hall. I want the main suite pristine for them. And make sure you wire $12,000 to the event designer by tomorrow morning. She is bringing in custom floral arrangements from Holland, and I will not have my sisters thinking we cut corners. I kept my foot steady on the accelerator, listening to the sheer audacity echoing through the speakers. Vivian was ordering me to vacate the master bedroom of a $4.5 million estate, so her deadbeat 32-year-old son could impress a woman he had met 3 weeks ago. She was commanding me to hand over $12,000 for flowers to impress a group of judgmental women who spent their time critiquing other people's lives over expensive brunch. But the most staggering part of her demand was the location itself. The Alto Lake Mansion. She was demanding control over the exact same property her son had just fraudulently transferred to his mistress, using forged documents inside a red folder. The overlapping layers of their entitlement were almost poetic. I will have the funds transferred by morning, Vivian, I said. My voice was smooth and perfectly modulated, betraying none of the absolute destruction I was currently plotting. I will make sure the master suite is ready for Terrence. See that you do, Vivian replied crisply. The event designer needs to start the installation on Thursday. Do not be late with the wire transfer. I cannot afford any embarrassments this weekend. She disconnected the call without another word. The screen went black, and the silence returned to the car. I let out a soft, humorless laugh that vanished quickly into the quiet cabin. I cannot afford any embarrassments. That single sentence summarized the entire existence of my husband's family. They lived their lives performing for an audience of peers, terrified of ever looking less than extraordinary. For 10 years, I had been the silent architect of their grand illusion. To the outside world, Derek was the ultimate success story. He was a brilliant investment fund director, a pillar of black excellence, who provided his wife and his family with an exceptionally luxurious lifestyle. Society saw him driving a 6-figure sports car, wearing tailored Italian suits, and hosting lavish dinners at the country club. They praised him as the perfect provider, while viewing me as the lucky, supportive wife who ran a nice little tech business on the side. That was the public narrative. The unspoken reality was a radically different story. Derek's salary as a director at Sterling Capital was approximately $400,000 a year. It was an impressive figure for most people, but it was absolute pocket change compared to the lifestyle his family demanded. The maintenance on the Alto Lake Mansion alone cost over $100,000 annually. The luxury vehicles, the endless stream of designer clothing, Vivian's country club fees, and Terrence's constantly failing business ventures required millions. Derek could not afford a fraction of the life he was living. I paid for all of it. My financial technology company, which I had founded in my 20s, had quietly exploded in value. Our payment processing algorithms were licensed by major banking institutions across the globe, generating astronomical revenues. But I had deliberately structured my wealth through a labyrinth of anonymous holding companies and blind trusts. I did not want the fame, the Forbes lists, or the endless scrutiny that came with being a highly visible young black female billionaire. I wanted privacy. I wanted security. More importantly, I had wanted to protect my husband's fragile ego. Early in our marriage, I recognized that Derek's pride was deeply tied to his perception of himself as the traditional provider. When my company's valuation skyrocketed, I saw the subtle resentment brewing in his eyes. To save my marriage, I made a fatal mistake. I shrank myself. I downplayed my success. I set up automated monthly transfers from my anonymous corporate accounts into a joint offshore account. I told Derek it was return on investment from some early smart stock picks. I allowed him to use those funds to pay the mortgages, buy the cars, and shower his mother and brother with money. I let him play the king while I secretly funded the treasury. I subsidized his entire family's existence solely to maintain the peace and to keep the man I loved feeling powerful. And how had he repaid that profound level of financial and emotional devotion? He weaponized my own money against me. He used the wealth I graciously provided to build a separate life with my best friend. He used the very resources I placed in his hands to buy Camille a $45,000 diamond necklace. And now he was actively conspiring to steal the actual underlying assets, trying to strip me of the real estate and the corporate equity I had worked so desperately to build. The ultimate betrayal was not just the physical act of cheating, it was the absolute lack of respect. Vivian's phone call was a perfect reflection of that dynamic. She treated me as a convenient administrative assistant for her social life. She demanded $12,000 for floral arrangements, with the same casual expectation one might use when asking a barista for a cup of coffee. She ordered me out of my own master bedroom because in her mind I was just an accessory to Derek's greatness. She genuinely believed her son was the source of the family's wealth, and I was merely a beneficiary who needed to learn her place. She had no idea that the Alto Lake mansion belonged entirely to an LLC registered under my maiden name. She had no idea that the event designer, the catering staff, and the groundskeepers were all paid from a trust fund that I alone controlled. And she certainly had no idea that by Sunday morning, the majestic estate she planned to show off to her sorority sisters would no longer be available to her or anyone else in her arrogant family. I pulled the Maybach into the long, sweeping driveway of our primary residence in the affluent Chastain Park neighborhood. The massive iron gates swung open automatically, recognizing the transponder in my vehicle. I drove up to the sprawling, modern estate, the exterior illuminated by carefully placed landscape lighting. It looked like a fortress of success and happiness. It was nothing but a house of cards. I parked the car in the garage, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a few moments. The $12,000 Vivian demanded would be the absolute last dime she or anyone in that toxic ecosystem would ever extract from my accounts. I would wire the money tomorrow morning exactly as promised. I needed them to feel completely secure. I needed Vivian to believe her party was moving forward smoothly. I needed Derek to believe his forged documents had gone unnoticed. I needed Camille to continue parading around town wearing my diamonds, feeling like the ultimate victor. The element of surprise requires absolute stillness before the strike. I gathered my purse and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit my face as I walked toward the entrance of the house. Inside, the grand foyer was dark and silent. Derek was obviously still wrapped up in his important board meeting with Camille. I walked past the sweeping staircase and headed directly into my private home office, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I booted up my encrypted workstation, typing in the complex series of passwords that protected my financial empire. The monitors glowing brightly in the dark room, casting sharp shadows across my desk. It was time to stop being the accommodating wife. It was time to stop funding the illusion. I opened the secure portal that managed the joint accounts I shared with Derek. I did not freeze them immediately. That would trigger an alert to his phone and ruin the carefully timed execution I was planning for the days ahead. Instead, I began mapping out the exact sequence of legal and financial maneuvers required to legally paralyze him. Vivian wanted the perfect weekend to show off her family's status. Terrence wanted a luxury car showroom to play businessman. Derek wanted to steal my company and hand my lake house to my best friend. They had all grown incredibly fat off my unseen labor. They had taken my grace for weakness and my silence for ignorance. As I clicked through the financial records verifying the staggering amounts of money Derek had quietly funneled away over the past year, My resolve hardened into an unbreakable diamond. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I would let them climb to the very peak of their arrogance. And then I was going to cut the safety line and watch them fall. The next morning arrived with a brilliant golden sunrise over the Atlanta skyline. I stepped out of my private elevator and onto the top floor of the Aegis Financial Technologies Tower. The polished marble floors clicked under my Christian Louboutin heels, echoing with the authority of a woman who owned the building. My corporate sanctuary was a masterclass in modern power. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered an uninterrupted view of Buckhead, while minimalist abstract art lined the pristine white walls. As I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, my executives and engineering teams offered respectful nods. Here I was, not the quiet and accommodating wife of Derek. Here I was, the undisputed architect of a billion-dollar software ecosystem. I had spent the entire night finalizing the digital barricades around my personal assets, ensuring that Derek and his mistress would find nothing but locked vaults when they finally tried to execute their fraudulent transfers. I sat behind my massive black walnut desk, opening my encrypted terminal to begin the day. The adrenaline from the previous night had settled into a sharp and highly focused state of execution. I reviewed the wire transfer I had just sent to Vivian for her ridiculous floral arrangements. $12,000 successfully deposited into the event designer account. It was the final piece of bait required to keep my mother-in-law entirely distracted by her own vanity. Just as I was reviewing our latest quarterly earnings report, the heavy oak door to my office swung open without so much as a warning knock. My executive assistant hastily stepped into the room looking profoundly apologetic. "I am so sorry, Ms. Serena," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "I told him you were in a secure planning session, but he insisted that family does not need an appointment." I raised a calm hand to dismiss my assistant, signaling that it was fine. Pushing his way past her was Terrence. At 32 years old, Derek's younger brother was a walking monument to unearned arrogance and financial incompetence. He strutted into my office wearing a flashy, custom-tailored suit that was far too tight across the shoulders, accompanied by a pair of ostentatious designer loafers that screamed newly acquired wealth. Terrence had never worked a legitimate 40-hour week in his entire adult life. He was a professional opportunist who survived solely on the massive allowances Derek funneled to him from my accounts. He viewed himself as a brilliant entrepreneur who was constantly just one deal away from building an empire of his own. In harsh reality, he was a parasitic liability who routinely destroyed every investment he touched. "Morning, sister-in-law," Terrence announced, dropping his large leather briefcase onto one of my imported Italian lounge chairs. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I had a moment to spare. He simply claimed the space with the suffocating entitlement that Vivian had instilled in both of her sons. I leaned back in my chair, clasping my hands together and resting them on the cool surface of my desk. "Good morning, Terrence. To what do I owe the pleasure of this unannounced visit?" He flashed a brilliant white smile that mirrored Derek's face perfectly. "I am bringing you the opportunity of a lifetime, Serena. I know you tech people love a solid return on investment, and I'm about to hand you a gold mine." He unzipped his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. He marched over to my desk and dropped the paperwork directly over my quarterly earnings reports. I glanced down at the bold heading printed across the top page. It was a commercial lease agreement for a prime piece of real estate in the heart of the Buckhead shopping district. "I am opening a luxury automotive showroom," Terrence declared, puffing out his chest and pacing across my office. "We are talking high-end exotic imports, exclusively catering to athletes, entertainers, and the corporate elite of Atlanta. I have the supply chain locked down, and the marketing strategy is going to completely disrupt the local industry. It is a guaranteed cash cow, Serena." I looked at the commercial lease agreement and then back up at him, keeping my expression entirely void of emotion. "That sounds incredibly ambitious, Terrence, but why bring a commercial lease agreement to my office?" His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning with doubled intensity. "Because I need a silent partner to push the paperwork across the finish line. The commercial property landlords operating in this exclusive district are ridiculously strict about their massive liquidity requirements. They want a guarantor with a flawless financial history and massive verifiable assets to co-sign the lease. He tapped his manicured index finger against the stack of papers. The total lease obligation over the next 5 years is roughly $800,000. I need you to sign this as the primary financial guarantor. My older brother already cleared it with me. The sheer audacity of the demand hung heavily in the quiet air of my office. Terrence was demanding that I place my personal financial reputation on the line to guarantee an $800,000 commercial lease for a man who did not even know how to balance a basic checking account. He expected me to take on nearly $1 million in legal liability for a phantom luxury car business that was destined to completely collapse within 6 months. I kept my breathing slow and steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. $800,000 is a massive liability to assume for an unproven business model, Terrence. Derek handles our family investments. Why is he not co-signing this lease for you? Terrence scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You know how the compliance regulations work at his investment fund? Sterling Capital has strict rules about directors co-signing commercial loans for family members due to conflict of interest policies. Derek specifically told me to bring this straight to you. He said you would handle it without any hesitation. I slowly picked up the commercial lease agreement, flipping through the first few pages with meticulous care. Terrence was lying. The real reason Derek was not co-signing the lease was because Derek did not actually possess the legitimate assets required to pass a commercial background check. Derek's entire financial profile was artificially inflated by the money I quietly funneled into his accounts. Terrence shifted his weight clearly, growing impatient with my silence. Look, Serena, we do not need to play games here. Derek told me your firm just closed a massive new funding round last quarter. We all know you are sitting on a mountain of liquid capital that is not doing anything but gathering interest in a corporate vault. Do not be selfish. Family supports family. I looked up, meeting his gaze with an icy, calculating stare. And what happens if I decide that assuming an $800,000 risk does not align with my current financial strategy? Terrence stopped pacing. The charming brother-in-law routine instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, threatening sneer. The mask of polite family unity fell away, revealing the toxic extortionist lurking underneath. You do not want to go down that road, Serena, Terrence warned, leaning over my desk and placing both hands flat on the mahogany surface. Mom is hosting her huge anniversary event for you and Derek at the Alto Lake Mansion this weekend. She is bringing all the heavy hitters from the Buckhead Women's Coalition. You know exactly how much influence she wields over the executive board of that organization. He lowered his voice, dropping the final threat like a physical weapon. If you do not sign these documents today and help me secure my showroom, Mom will make sure your membership at the coalition is permanently revoked. She will blackball you from every single high society charity gala and elite networking event in Atlanta. You will be completely exiled from the community. It would be a terrible shame for your little tech business to lose all those valuable social connections just because you refuse to help your own family. I stared, letting the absolute absurdity of his threat wash over me. They genuinely believed my real power came from attending champagne brunches and charity galas, rather than controlling the payment processing infrastructure of half the businesses in this city. Instead, I chose to feed his delusion. If I refused to sign, he would simply find another victim to scam. If I agreed, he would eagerly walk straight into a financial bear trap of his own making. I let a look of defeated submission cross my face, lowering my eyes. You make a point, Terrence, I said quietly. I will sign it today. He smirked, completely unaware of his total ruin. The weekend arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the Georgia pines surrounding the Alto Lake Mansion. My $4.5 million sanctuary had been completely hijacked, transformed into a glittering stage for Vivian's ultimate societal performance. As I drove up the winding private road, the sheer scale of the theft happening in plain sight was staggering. Valets in crisp white uniforms rushed to open doors for arriving guests, while a string quartet played classical renditions of modern rhythm and blues near the massive infinity pool. Vivian and Derek had spared absolutely no expense using my money to stage this opulent 10th anniversary party. They had invited the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's black elite, including politicians, mega church pastors, and real estate moguls, who all believed they were attending a celebration of black love funded by a financial genius. I walked through the towering glass front doors of the estate, wearing a custom ivory gown that draped flawlessly against my skin. I kept my posture impossibly straight, wearing the serene, unbothered smile of a woman who was perfectly content to remain in the background. The grand foyer was packed with people sipping imported champagne and marveling at the custom floral arrangements Vivian had demanded. The massive bursts of rare Dutch orchids and cascading white roses looked spectacular, entirely paid for by the $12,000 wire transfer I had authorized just 36 hours prior. I watched as Vivian glided across the Italian marble floors, greeting her sorority sisters and the influential wives of the Buckhead Women's Coalition. She wore a shimmering gold dress that caught the light with every step, acting as the undisputed queen of a castle she did not actually own. "Serena, darling." Vivian called out, her voice slicing through the elegant chatter. She approached me, flanked by three of her most judgmental friends. The older women looked me up and down with that polite yet critical assessment unique to high society circles. "You finally made it out of your home office," Vivian remarked, flashing a smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "We were beginning to think you were going to skip your own anniversary party to play on your computer. I hear the tech sector is just so demanding these days." I smiled back, keeping my voice light and entirely devoid of the venom boiling in my veins. "Someone has to keep the digital lights on, Mother Vivian." The women chuckled politely, but I could see the distinct look of condescension in their eyes. To them, I was a cute accessory, a woman who dabbled in writing code while her husband carried the heavy financial burdens of the family. They praised Vivian for raising such an incredible provider, never realizing the designer shoes on their feet were resting on property I had purchased in cash. Before I could extract myself from the suffocating circle of Vivian's friends, a high-pitched squeal echoed near the entrance. I turned to see Camille making her grand arrival. She looked radiant, wearing a plunging crimson dress that hugged her curves and commanded the attention of every man in the room. And resting flawlessly against her collarbone was my $45,000 custom diamond and sapphire necklace. The sheer audacity of her wearing stolen property into my home surrounded by my guests was breathtaking. Camille rushed toward me with her arms extended wide, performing the role of the ecstatic best friend with terrifying accuracy. "Serena," she cheered, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck and pulling me into a warm embrace. The scent of her expensive perfume filled my nose, mixing with the sickening reality of her betrayal. "Happy anniversary, bestie. I cannot believe it has been 10 years since we were running across the campus yard. You and Derek are literal goals." I forced myself to return the embrace, patting her back gently, while staring directly at the stolen diamonds resting against her skin. "Thank you, Camille," I replied smoothly, stepping back just enough to admire the jewelry. "You look absolutely stunning tonight. That necklace is truly breathtaking. It looks incredibly expensive." Camille touched the center teardrop diamond, feigning a look of humble bashfulness. "Oh, this old thing," she laughed, waving her hand dismissively. "It was a gift from a very special investor who believes in my potential. He told me it represents a rare milestone. He is so incredibly generous." My stomach turned at the hidden double meaning of her words, but my facial expression remained perfectly composed. "It is a very unique piece," I noted. "Make sure you hold on to it tightly. Things of such high value have a habit of disappearing when you least expect it." Camille smirked, completely missing the lethal promise hiding behind my polite warning. I excused myself from the group and moved toward the massive outdoor terrace where the bulk of the party was taking place. The evening air was thick with the smell of expensive catered cuisine and the sound of clinking crystal. Everywhere I looked, I saw parasites gorge themselves on my wealth. I watched Terrence holding court near the outdoor bar, bragging loudly to a group of local athletes about his upcoming luxury auto showroom. He was promising them exclusive deals and VIP access puffing out his chest as he detailed the massive commercial lease he claimed he had secured entirely on his own merit. He had no idea the bank had already flagged the documents I submitted, triggering a massive fraud alert that would soon freeze his entire existence. I walked past a group of powerful investment bankers who worked alongside Derek at Sterling Capital. They nodded at me politely before turning their attention back to my husband, who was standing at the center of the terrace, acting like the ultimate conquering hero. Derek wore a custom tuxedo holding a glass of scotch and gesturing expansively as he entertained his colleagues with tales of his financial conquests. "Look at this property," one of the senior partners remarked, gesturing toward the pristine lake reflecting the sunset. "You have really outdone yourself, Derek. Buying prime real estate on Alto Lake is nearly impossible these days. The zoning restrictions alone usually scare off most buyers." Derek chuckled, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "It took some aggressive maneuvering. I will admit he boasted loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the surrounding tables. But when you understand the market mechanics, you can bend the board to your will. I knew this estate would be the perfect anniversary gift for Serena. She needs a quiet place to run her little tech business away from the noise of the city. I'm just glad I can provide a sanctuary for her." I stood a few feet away listening to my husband claim ownership of the sanctuary I had purchased long before he ever made his first significant bonus. The men laughed and praised his business acumen, clapping him on the back for being such a stellar provider. Derek soaked up their admiration with an arrogant smile, basking in the glory of an empire he was actively trying to steal. "Serena is lucky to have a man who understands true wealth accumulation," another executive added, looking in my direction with a patronizing nod. "Tech startups are incredibly volatile. It is good she has your portfolio to fall back on when the market inevitably corrects itself." I smiled gently, holding my glass of sparkling water with perfectly steady hands. "Derek has always been very aggressive with his acquisitions," I replied, my tone completely even. "He truly understands how to take possession of assets." The executives nodded in agreement, entirely ignorant to the fact that Derek's primary acquisition strategy involved forging my signature and illegally licensing my intellectual property to keep his firm afloat. The psychological toll of enduring this toxic ecosystem was immense. For hours, I was forced to smile gracefully as people who fed off my anonymous labor insulted my intelligence and diminished my success. I listened to Vivian complain to the pastor's wife about how difficult it was to teach me proper high society etiquette because I spent too much time looking at computer screens. I watched Camille lean casually against Derek's arm whenever she thought I was not looking, sharing secret smiles that mocked our marriage vows. I absorbed every insult, every microaggression, every condescending pat on the arm, with the stoic endurance of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. They thought they had broken me into complete submission. They believed my silence was a symptom of weakness and my compliance was a sign of financial dependency. The reality was that my silence was the direct result of intense calculation. Every arrogant boast Derek made, every fake compliment Camille delivered, and every demanding order Vivian issued only fueled the absolute devastation I was preparing to unleash upon them. As the evening wore on, the sun finally dipped below the tree line, casting the Alto Lake mansion in a glow of artificial amber lighting. The string quartet transitioned into a slow, romantic melody, signaling that it was time for the formal anniversary toasts. Guests began to gather around the main terrace, holding their champagne flutes and waiting for the happy couple to take the stage. I saw Derek catch Camille's eye across the crowd, giving her a subtle, confident wink before turning his gaze toward me. He extended his hand, offering me a warm, loving smile that would have easily won an Academy Award for Best Actor in a Leading Role. It was time for the grand finale of his performance. It was time for him to execute the legal maneuver that he believed would permanently hand him control of my entire existence. I placed my sparkling water on a passing waiter's tray, smoothed down the front of my ivory gown, and walked gracefully toward my husband. The trap was fully set. The parasites were happily feeding on my resources, and the executioner was perfectly disguised as the sacrificial lamb ready to follow the script until the very last page. To the outside world, Derek was the ultimate success story. He was a brilliant investment fund director, a pillar of black excellence, who provided his wife and his family with an exceptionally luxurious lifestyle. Society saw him driving a six-figure sports car, wearing tailored Italian suits, and hosting lavish dinners at the country club. They praised him as the perfect provider, while viewing me as the lucky, supportive wife who ran a nice little tech business on the side. That was the public narrative. The unspoken reality was a radically different story. Derek's salary as a director at Sterling Capital was approximately $400,000 a year. It was an impressive figure for most people, but it was absolute pocket change compared to the lifestyle his family demanded. The maintenance on the Alto Lake mansion alone cost over $100,000 annually. The luxury vehicles, the endless stream of designer clothing, Vivian's country club fees, and Terrence's constantly failing business ventures required millions. Derek could not afford a fraction of the life he was living. I paid for all of it. My financial technology company, which I had founded in my 20s, had quietly exploded in value. Our payment processing algorithms were licensed by major banking institutions across the globe, generating astronomical revenues. But I had deliberately structured my wealth through a labyrinth of anonymous holding companies and blind trusts. I did not want the fame, the Forbes lists, or the endless scrutiny that came with being a highly visible young black female billionaire. I wanted privacy. I wanted security. More importantly, I had wanted to protect my husband's fragile ego. Early in our marriage, I recognized that Derek's pride was deeply tied to his perception of himself as the traditional provider. When my company's valuation skyrocketed, I saw the subtle resentment brewing in his eyes. To save my marriage, I made a fatal mistake. I shrank myself. I downplayed my success. I set up automated monthly transfers from my anonymous corporate accounts into a joint offshore account. I told Derek it was return on investment from some early smart stock picks. I allowed him to use those funds to pay the mortgages, buy the cars, and shower his mother and brother with money. I let him play the king while I secretly funded the treasury. I subsidized his entire family's existence solely to maintain the peace and to keep the man I loved feeling powerful. And how had he repaid that profound level of financial and emotional devotion? He weaponized my own money against me. He used the wealth I graciously provided to build a separate life with my best friend. He used the very resources I placed in his hands to buy Camille a $45,000 diamond necklace. And now he was actively conspiring to steal the actual underlying assets, trying to strip me of the real estate and the corporate equity I had worked so desperately to build. The ultimate betrayal was not just the physical act of cheating, it was the absolute lack of respect. Vivian's phone call was a perfect reflection of that dynamic. She treated me as a convenient administrative assistant for her social life. She demanded $12,000 for floral arrangements, with the same casual expectation one might use when asking a barista for a cup of coffee. She ordered me out of my own master bedroom, because in her mind, I was just an accessory to Derek's greatness. She genuinely believed her son was the source of the family's wealth, and I was merely a beneficiary who needed to learn her place. She had no idea that the Alto Lake mansion belonged entirely to an LLC registered under my maiden name. She had no idea that the event designer, the catering staff, and the groundskeepers were all paid from a trust fund that I alone controlled. And she certainly had no idea that by Sunday morning the majestic estate she planned to show off to her sorority sisters would no longer be available to her or anyone else in her arrogant family. I pulled the Maybach into the long, sweeping driveway of our primary residence in the affluent Chastain Park neighborhood. The massive iron gates swung open automatically, recognizing the transponder in my vehicle. I drove up to the sprawling modern estate, the exterior illuminated by carefully placed landscape lighting. It looked like a fortress of success and happiness. It was nothing but a house of cards. I parked the car in the garage, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a few moments. The $12,000 Vivian demanded would be the absolute last dime she or anyone in that toxic ecosystem would ever extract from my accounts. I would wire the money tomorrow morning exactly as promised. I needed them to feel completely secure. I needed Vivian to believe her party was moving forward smoothly. I needed Derek to believe his forged documents had gone unnoticed. I needed Camille to continue parading around town wearing my diamonds, feeling like the ultimate victor. The element of surprise requires absolute stillness before the strike. I gathered my purse and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit my face as I walked toward the entrance of the house. Inside, the grand foyer was dark and silent. Derek was obviously still wrapped up in his important board meeting with Camille. I walked past the sweeping staircase and headed directly into my private home office, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I booted up my encrypted workstation, typing in the complex series of passwords that protected my financial empire. The monitors glowing brightly in the dark room, casting sharp shadows across my desk. It was time to stop being the accommodating wife. It was time to stop funding the illusion. I opened the secure portal that managed the joint accounts I shared with Derek. I did not freeze them immediately. That would trigger an alert to his phone and ruin the carefully timed execution I was planning for the days ahead. Instead, I began mapping out the exact sequence of legal and financial maneuvers required to legally paralyze him. Vivian wanted the perfect weekend to show off her family's status. Terrence wanted a luxury car showroom to play businessman. Derek wanted to steal my company and hand my lake house to my best friend. They had all grown incredibly fat off my unseen labor. They had taken my grace for weakness and my silence for ignorance. As I clicked through the financial records, verifying the staggering amounts of money Derek had quietly funneled away over the past year, my resolve hardened into an unbreakable diamond. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I would let them climb to the very peak of their arrogance, and then I was going to cut the safety line and watch them fall. The next morning arrived with a brilliant golden sunrise over the Atlanta skyline. I stepped out of my private elevator and onto the top floor of the Aegis Financial Technologies Tower. The polished marble floors clicked under my Christian Louboutin heels, echoing with the authority of a woman who owned the building. My corporate sanctuary was a masterclass in modern power. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered an uninterrupted view of Buckhead, while minimalist abstract art lined the pristine white walls. As I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, my executives and engineering teams offered respectful nods. Here I was, not the quiet and accommodating wife of Derek. Here I was, the undisputed architect of a billion-dollar software ecosystem. I had spent the entire night finalizing the digital barricades around my personal assets, ensuring that Derek and his mistress would find nothing but locked vaults when they finally tried to execute their fraudulent transfers. I sat behind my massive black walnut desk, opening my encrypted terminal to begin the day. The adrenaline from the previous night had settled into a sharp and highly focused state of execution. I reviewed the wire transfer I had just sent to Vivian for her ridiculous floral arrangements. $12,000 successfully deposited into the event designer account. It was the final piece of bait required to keep my mother-in-law entirely distracted by her own vanity. Just as I was reviewing our latest quarterly earnings report, the heavy oak door to my office swung open without so much as a warning knock. My executive assistant hastily stepped into the room, looking profoundly apologetic. "I am so sorry, Ms. Serena," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "I told him you were in a secure planning session, but he insisted that family does not need an appointment." I raised a calm hand to dismiss my assistant, signaling that it was fine. Pushing his way past her was Terrence. At 32 years old, Derek's younger brother was a walking monument to unearned arrogance and financial incompetence. He strutted into my office wearing a flashy, custom-tailored suit that was far too tight across the shoulders, accompanied by a pair of ostentatious designer loafers that screamed newly acquired wealth. Terrence had never worked a legitimate 40-hour week in his entire adult life. He was a professional opportunist who survived solely on the massive allowances Derek funneled to him from my accounts. He viewed himself as a brilliant entrepreneur who was constantly just one deal away from building an empire of his own. In harsh reality, he was a parasitic liability who routinely destroyed every investment he touched. "Morning, sister-in-law," Terrence announced, dropping his large leather briefcase onto one of my imported Italian lounge chairs. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I had a moment to spare. He simply claimed the space with the suffocating entitlement that Vivian had instilled in both of her sons. I leaned back in my chair, clasping my hands together and resting them on the cool surface of my desk. "Good morning, Terrence," To what do I owe the pleasure of this unannounced visit? He flashed a brilliant white smile that mirrored Derek's face perfectly. I am bringing you the opportunity of a lifetime, Serena. I know you tech people love a solid return on investment, and I am about to hand you a gold mine. He unzipped his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. He marched over to my desk and dropped the paperwork directly over my quarterly earnings reports. I glanced down at the bold heading printed across the top page. It was a commercial lease agreement for a prime piece of real estate in the heart of the Buckhead shopping district. I am opening a luxury automotive showroom, Terrence declared, puffing out his chest and pacing across my office. We are talking high-end exotic imports, exclusively catering to athletes, entertainers, and the corporate elite of Atlanta. I have the supply chain locked down, and the marketing strategy is going to completely disrupt the local industry. It is a guaranteed cash cow, Serena. I looked at the commercial lease agreement and then back up at him, keeping my expression entirely void of emotion. That sounds incredibly ambitious, Terrence. But why bring a commercial lease agreement to my office? His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning with doubled intensity. Because I need a silent partner to push the paperwork across the finish line. The commercial property landlords operating in this exclusive district are ridiculously strict about their massive liquidity requirements. They want a guarantor with a flawless financial history and massive verifiable assets to co-sign the lease. He tapped his manicured index finger against the stack of papers. The total lease obligation over the next 5 years is roughly $800,000. I need you to sign this as the primary financial guarantor. My older brother already cleared it with me. The sheer audacity of the demand hung heavily in the quiet air of my office. Terrence was demanding that I place my personal financial reputation on the line to guarantee an $800,000 commercial lease for a man who did not even know how to balance a basic checking account. He expected me to take on nearly $1 million in legal liability for a phantom luxury car business that was destined to completely collapse within 6 months. I kept my breathing slow and steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. $800,000 is a massive liability to assume for an unproven business model, Terrence. Derek handles our family investments. Why is he not co-signing this lease for you? Terrence scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You know how the compliance regulations work at his investment fund. Sterling Capital has strict rules about directors co-signing commercial loans for family members due to conflict of interest policies. Derek specifically told me to bring this straight to you. He said you would handle it without any hesitation. I slowly picked up the commercial lease agreement, flipping through the first few pages with meticulous care. Terrence was lying. The real reason Derek was not co-signing the lease was because Derek did not actually possess the legitimate assets required to pass a commercial background check. Derek's entire financial profile was artificially inflated by the money I quietly funneled into his accounts. Terrence shifted his weight, clearly growing impatient with my silence. Look, Serena, we do not need to play games here. Derek told me your firm just closed a massive new funding round last quarter. We all know you are sitting on a mountain of liquid capital that is not doing anything but gathering interest in a corporate vault. Do not be selfish. Family supports family. I looked up, meeting his gaze with an icy, calculating stare. And what happens if I decide that assuming an $800,000 risk does not align with my current financial strategy? Terrence stopped pacing. The charming brother-in-law routine instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, threatening sneer. The mask of polite family unity fell away, revealing the toxic extortionist lurking underneath. You do not want to go down that road, Serena, Terrence warned, leaning over my desk and placing both hands flat on the mahogany surface. Mom is hosting her huge anniversary event for you and Derek at the Alto Lake Mansion this weekend. She is bringing all the heavy hitters from the Buckhead Women's Coalition. You know exactly how much influence she wields over the executive board of that organization. He lowered his voice, dropping the final threat like a physical weapon. If you do not sign these documents today and help me secure my showroom, Mom will make sure your membership at the coalition is permanently revoked. She will blackball you from every single high society charity gala and elite networking event in Atlanta. You will be completely exiled from the community. It would be a terrible shame for your little tech business to lose all those valuable social connections just because you refuse to help your own family. I stared, letting the absolute absurdity of his threat wash over me. They genuinely believed my real power came from attending champagne brunches and charity galas rather than controlling the payment processing infrastructure of half the businesses in this city. Instead, I chose to feed his delusion. If I refused to sign, he would simply find another victim to scam. If I agreed, he would eagerly walk straight into a financial bear trap of his own making. I let a look of defeated submission cross my face, lowering my eyes. "You make a point, Terrence," I said quietly. "I will sign it today." He smirked, completely unaware of his total ruin. I reached Derek just as he tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The sharp chiming sound cut through the ambient music and the low hum of wealthy conversations. The string quartet immediately faded into silence. 500 of Atlanta's most influential figures turned their attention toward the elevated stone patio overlooking the dark, shimmering waters of the lake. Derek took my hand, pulling me up the two shallow steps to stand beside him. His grip was tight, controlling, and entirely performative. I stood there in my ivory gown, looking out at a sea of expectant faces. Politicians, venture capitalists, and socialites gazed back at us, holding their breath for what they assumed would be a touching tribute to a decade of Black excellence and marital devotion. Derek brought the microphone to his lips, flashing that devastatingly handsome smile that had once convinced me he was a man of honor. 10 years, he began, his voice echoing richly across the manicured lawns. 10 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I married this beautiful woman standing beside me. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Vivian beamed from the front row, surrounded by her sorority sisters. Camille stood just behind them, wiping away a completely fabricated tear. Derek raised his free hand to quiet the crowd. "We have built an incredible life together," he continued, gesturing broadly to the sprawling mansion and the expensive event design. "But anyone in business knows that behind every successful man is a woman who needs a strong foundation. Serena is a brilliant creative soul. She built a cute little tech startup from scratch, and I have always admired her passion. But passion does not protect you from the harsh realities of the corporate world." A murmur of agreement rippled through the older men in the audience. I kept my face perfectly still, maintaining a soft, adoring smile. Derek was laying the groundwork. He was publicly defining my massive financial technology empire as a cute little startup, while positioning himself as the mature, seasoned financial guardian. "The business world is ruthless," Derek said, his tone shifting into a practiced display of somber concern. "It takes a certain kind of fortitude to navigate the brutal waves of corporate finance. Serena is a wonderful wife, a gentle spirit, but she is a woman who needs a man's financial protection. Lately, her little company has hit some severe regulatory turbulence. It is facing a massive wave of unforeseen legal liabilities that could completely ruin her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Vivian shook her head with exaggerated pity, performing for her friends. Camille covered her mouth, feigning shock. I stood frozen, letting the sheer weight of his public lie wash over me. My company was not facing any legal trouble. My firm had just secured a flawless compliance audit, and our valuation was higher than ever. Derek was fabricating a public crisis to justify a hostile takeover of my assets in front of 500 witnesses. He was using the deeply ingrained patriarchal biases of the room to strip me of my agency and paint himself as my ultimate savior. "When you love someone, you step into the fire for them," Derek proclaimed, his voice rising with heroic conviction. "You take the burden off their shoulders. I refuse to let my wife face financial ruin alone. I refuse to let her carry the weight of corporate liabilities that she is simply not equipped to handle. That is why tonight I am not just giving her a toast. I am giving her the gift of absolute security." He reached inside his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick document bound in heavy legal stock. He unrolled it and placed it on the small acrylic podium in front of us. It was titled Asset Separation and Liability Assumption Agreement. This document, Derek explained to the captivated audience, officially transfers all the legal liabilities of Serena's company over to my investment fund. Sterling Capital will absorb the risk. We will take on the debt, the lawsuits, and the regulatory mess. Serena will be completely insulated. She can go back to focusing on her creative hobbies without the stress of impending bankruptcy. The crowd broke into rapturous applause. Men nodded in deep respect at his sacrifice. Women looked at me with varying degrees of envy and pity. They thought Derek was falling on his sword to save his helpless wife from going to prison. In reality, that document was a lethal weapon. It contained no clauses about absorbing liabilities because there were no liabilities to absorb. The document was a legally binding transfer that would hand 60% of my founder's equity directly into Derek's offshore holding accounts. It was a complete corporate hijacking executed under the guise of an anniversary rescue mission. Derek pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and offered it to me. "All you have to do is sign my queen," he whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear the cold, metallic edge in his voice. "Sign it, and let me take care of everything." I hesitated, letting a look of perfect vulnerability cross my face. I looked down at the document, then back out at the crowd. The silence grew heavy and expectant. Suddenly, the physical space around me shrank. Vivian and Camille materialized from the front row, stepping up onto the patio to flank me on either side. They moved with coordinated precision, boxing me in, trapping me between my fraudulent husband, my backstabbing best friend, and my tyrannical mother-in-law. Vivian leaned in, pressing her manicured hand painfully into the small of my back. "Do not embarrass us, Serena," she hissed through a forced smile, her teeth gritted together. "Everyone is watching. Derek is saving you from your own incompetence. Be a good wife and sign the paper before you make a scene." Camille placed her hand on my shoulder, squeezing tight. Her stolen diamond necklace sparkled in my peripheral vision. "Just sign it, sweetie," Camille whispered, projecting her voice just loud enough for the closest guests to hear her fake concern. "Derek is doing this to protect you. You are so stressed lately. Let him carry the heavy lifting. You know he always handles the business side of things so well." The suffocating pressure was engineered to break a normal person. They had surrounded me physically, socially, and emotionally. They were banking on my fear of public humiliation to force my hand. They expected me to cave under the watchful eyes of Atlanta's elite, afraid to disrupt the elegant facade of the evening. They thought my pride would prevent me from reading the document or challenging my husband's heroic narrative. They were absolutely right about one thing. I was not going to make a scene. I allowed a profound look of overwhelming gratitude to wash over my features. I looked at Vivian, offering her a submissive nod. I looked at Camille, placing my hand over hers and giving it a gentle squeeze of appreciation. Then I turned to Derek, gazing up into his lying, deceitful eyes with the absolute devotion of a woman who had been thoroughly rescued. "You are so right," I said, my voice projecting clearly into the microphone so the entire ballroom could hear my capitulation. "I have been so overwhelmed. I do not know what I would do without you protecting me." I reached into my designer clutch, but I did not take the silver pen Derek was holding out to me. Instead, I pulled out my own pen. It was a heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc, a signature instrument fitting for a chief executive. What Derek and his accomplices did not know was that the ink cartridge inside this specific pen was highly specialized. I had sourced it from a proprietary chemical supplier used by private intelligence firms. It contained advanced disappearing ink. The ink flowed beautifully rich and dark blue, but within exactly 48 hours, the chemical compound would completely evaporate, leaving absolutely no trace behind. I unfastened the cap of the gold pen and leaned over the podium. I hovered my hand over the signature line of the Asset Separation and Liability Assumption Agreement. Derek's eyes were fixed on the paper, burning with greedy anticipation. Vivian's grip on my back loosened as she prepared to celebrate her final victory. Camille let out a small sigh of relief, adjusting her stolen necklace. I brought the pen down onto the heavy legal paper. I pressed firmly, executing my signature with flawless precision. Every loop, every sharp angle, every distinctive curve of my name was rendered in dark blue ink. I signed the transfer of 60% of my billionaire empire directly over to my husband, sealing my own financial doom in front of 500 applauding witnesses. I finished the signature, capped my pen, and slipped it back into my clutch. Derek snatched the document off the podium faster than a striking snake, his eyes scanning the ink to verify it was real. A look of euphoric triumph washed over his face. He had done it. He had stolen the crown jewels. He quickly folded the document and handed it to Terrence, who had been hovering near the stairs waiting to secure the paperwork in Derek's briefcase. I stepped back into Derek's personal space, wrapping my arms around his neck and leaning into his microphone one final time. "Thank you, Derek," I said, my voice echoing across the silent lake and the mesmerized crowd. "You always know exactly how to manage our assets." The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. People cheered for the display of traditional family values and marital loyalty. Vivian wiped away real tears of joy, knowing her son was now a certified titan of industry. Camille clapped enthusiastically, celebrating the financial windfall she was about to share with her lover. Derek wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me tight against his side and waving to his adoring public. I smiled warmly at the flashing cameras, maintaining my perfect posture. Let them cheer. Let them pop the imported champagne and toast to their brilliant deception. Let Derek believe he was walking away with my empire. In 48 hours, that legally binding contract would be nothing but a blank stack of useless paper. When he submitted it to his corporate lawyers and the federal regulatory boards, he would be submitting a blank document. But more importantly, he had just publicly declared on video in front of 500 high-profile witnesses that he was assuming total control and liability for an asset transfer that involved deeply forged documents. He had proudly claimed ownership of the very financial vehicle I was currently loading with explosive criminal evidence. The stage was officially set. The players had locked themselves into their designated roles. The trap had slammed completely shut, sealing Derek, Vivian, Terrence, and Camille inside a vault of their own design. My role as the quiet, accommodating victim was permanently over. The invisible counterstrike was already moving through the shadows, and by the time they realized what was happening, there would be absolutely nowhere left to run. The invisible counterstrike was already moving through the shadows, and by the time they realized what was happening, there would be absolutely nowhere left to run. 24 hours after the anniversary spectacle, I sat alone in the dimly lit VIP lounge of the Sovereign Club. This private membership establishment was tucked away in a discreet, heavily fortified corner of Midtown Atlanta. It was strictly off-limits to the flashy, newly rich crowd that my husband and his mother so desperately tried to impress. There were no valet lines boasting leased sports cars, and no socialites taking photographs for social media. The Sovereign Club was a sanctuary for old money and silent power, a place where billion-dollar acquisitions were negotiated over crystal glasses of imported bourbon. I checked the face of my Patek Philippe watch. It was precisely 9 o'clock in the evening. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, keeping my eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the private room. My mind was sharp, entirely cleared of the emotional debris that had clouded it over the weekend. I had successfully played the role of the docile, grateful wife. Derek was currently riding the high of his supposed victory, entirely convinced that my billion-dollar company was resting securely in the palm of his hand. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a soft click. The man from the Capitol Grill walked into the room. He moved with the same quiet, lethal grace that had commanded my attention nights earlier. Tonight he wore a dark navy bespoke suit tailored to absolute perfection, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. He did not look around the room to assess his surroundings because men like him already owned their environment. He walked directly to my secluded leather booth and took a seat across from me. "You execute a flawless signature, Serena," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that echoed with quiet authority. "For a moment, I actually believed you were going to hand your empire over to that incompetent fool." I leaned back against the plush leather, resting my hands on the table. "A disappearing ink cartridge is a remarkable tool in corporate warfare," I replied, my tone perfectly matching his calm demeanor. "The ink will evaporate completely by tomorrow morning, leaving my husband holding a blank piece of paper. But you already knew I had a plan." You did not risk approaching me at that restaurant just to offer friendly marital advice. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather portfolio, placing it gently on the table between us. "Allow me to formally introduce myself," he said, holding my gaze with intense predatory focus. "My name is Donovan Sterling. I am the founder and majority stakeholder of Sterling Capital." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow, but I kept my expression entirely neutral. Sterling Capital was the prestigious investment firm where Derek served as a director. It was the absolute center of my husband's professional pride and the primary source of his public arrogance. Derek constantly boasted about the brilliant moves he made for the firm, claiming he was the golden boy of the executive board. Now the architect of that entire institution was sitting across from me, looking at my husband like a predator observing wounded prey. "You are Derek's employer," I stated, processing the sheer magnitude of the situation. "I am the man who owns the vault your husband has been quietly robbing." Donovan corrected his tone, dropping to a glacial chill. He opened the black leather portfolio and turned it toward me. "I have spent the last 3 months conducting a covert internal audit of our offshore holding accounts. Your husband is not just a cheating, arrogant narcissist, Serena. He is a desperate, reckless thief." I looked down at the documents illuminated by the low light of the lounge. They were highly classified offshore bank records, wire transfer logs, and encrypted ledger summaries. The numbers printed across the pages were staggering. I had always known Derek was spending far beyond his salary, relying on the massive automated transfers I quietly funneled into his personal accounts. I thought my money was subsidizing the entirety of his opulent lifestyle. I was wrong. My money had simply not been enough to satisfy his insatiable greed. "Derek has embezzled precisely $2.5 million from Sterling Capital over the past 18 months, Donovan explained, tapping a manicured finger against a highlighted column of wire transfers. "He used a sophisticated series of dummy shell companies to siphon the capital directly out of our client escrow accounts. He thought he was covering his tracks by routing the funds through international servers, but my forensic accountants tracked every single dime." I scanned the ledger, my eyes locking onto the specific dates and transaction destinations. The puzzle pieces of my husband's spectacular betrayal violently snapped into place, forming a horrifying picture of his absolute moral bankruptcy. "Look at the disbursement dates," Donovan instructed, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. "He did not steal this money to make brilliant investments. He stole it to fund the pathetic illusion of his family's high society status." I traced my finger down the list of fraudulent wire transfers matching the dates to the extravagant purchases Derek had made over the past year and a half. There was a direct transfer of $45,000 routed to a luxury jeweler in Buckhead. It was processed 3 days before Derek claimed our wall safe was burglarized. He had not just stolen my necklace to give to Camille. He had used embezzled corporate funds to buy her a matching diamond bracelet and an entire collection of designer watches. Further down the page, I saw a massive recurring transfer totaling over $800,000. The recipient was a shell company registered under Terrence's name. My chest tightened as I realized the truth. Terrence's flashy designer suits, his constant trips to Miami, and his grand illusions of opening a luxury automotive showroom were not just the result of a spoiled younger brother playing with my money. Derek had been illegally funding Terrence's entire parasitic lifestyle using stolen capital to keep his brother living like a king. And then there were the country club fees. I stared at a series of massive payments routed directly to the executive board of the Buckhead Women's Coalition and the Alto Lake Country Club. Vivian's entire social facade, her grand charity sponsorships, her custom floral arrangements, and her undisputed status as the queen of Atlanta's black elite was entirely financed by federal wire fraud. Derek had stolen millions just to ensure his mother never had to face the reality of her own financial irrelevance. "He is completely exposed," I whispered, the sheer gravity of the crime settling over me. "He is a dead man walking," Donovan corrected smoothly, leaning back into the leather booth. "The Securities and Exchange Commission would shut his life down in a matter of hours if I handed over this portfolio." He committed federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and gross fiduciary negligence. He is looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I looked up from the documents, meeting Donovan's dark, calculating eyes. If you have the evidence to send him to federal prison, why are you sitting here with me? Why did you not just hand this over to the authorities and let the FBI drag him out of his office in handcuffs? Donovan offered a sharp, humorless smile. Because federal investigations are noisy, Serena. They damage corporate reputations, and they cause panic among wealthy investors. Sterling Capital relies on the absolute trust of our clients. A public scandal involving a director embezzling millions from escrow accounts would trigger a massive withdrawal of capital. I prefer to handle my garbage disposal quietly and with absolute precision. He reached out and tapped the final page of the ledger. But more importantly, I realized exactly what Derek was planning to do to you. I looked at the final page. It was a summary of the upcoming quarterly audit for Sterling Capital, scheduled to begin next Monday. A cold wave of realization washed over me. Derek was out of time. He knew the internal auditors were about to tear through the offshore accounts and discover the missing $2.5 million. He was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment and a lengthy prison sentence. That was the real reason behind the anniversary party. That was the real reason behind the asset separation and liability assumption agreement he had forced me to sign in front of 500 witnesses. He did not want to protect me from corporate liabilities. He was trying to steal 60% of my financial technology empire so he could instantly liquidate the equity and quietly replace the stolen $2.5 million before Donovan's auditors found the missing money. He was using my life's work as a shield to save himself from federal prison. He needed your company's liquidity to cover his tracks, Donovan said, verbalizing the exact thought running through my mind. He thought he could steal your empire, plug the hole in my vault, and walk away cleanly with his mistress while leaving you entirely bankrupt. It was a bold strategy. Too bad for him, he severely underestimated the intelligence of his wife. A fierce, dangerous energy ignited in my chest. The betrayal had officially transcended a simple, messy divorce. Derek was not just a cheating husband who had broken my heart. He was a federal criminal who had viewed my entire existence as a convenient sacrificial lamb to slaughter for his own salvation. He was willing to destroy my billion-dollar legacy to protect his mother's vanity, his brother's arrogance, and his mistress's greed. "What is your play, Donovan?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You want your $2.5 million back, and you want him gone without triggering a public scandal for your firm." "Exactly," Donovan replied, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute synergy. "We are two apex predators who have been targeted by a very stupid parasite. I want my capital returned, and I want him completely erased from the financial sector. You want to protect your empire and exact the kind of vengeance that leaves a lasting scar. I propose we combine our resources and utterly decimate him." I looked down at the black leather portfolio, feeling the immense power resting at my fingertips. I thought about Vivian ordering me out of my own master suite. I thought about Terrence demanding I co-sign an $800,000 lease. I thought about Camille wearing my diamonds and Derek smiling at the crowd as he attempted to steal my soul. They wanted to play corporate warfare. I was going to show them exactly why I owned the battlefield. "I accept your proposal, Donovan," I said, sliding the portfolio toward my side of the table. "Let us tear his world apart." The next morning, the sun breached the horizon, casting a blinding glare across the glass facades of Buckhead. I sat in my home office watching the digital clock on my encrypted terminal flip to 7 a.m. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had spent the dark hours meticulously laying the tripwires for the impending bloodbath. The alliance with Donovan had elevated this from a simple domestic separation into a coordinated multi-million-dollar corporate execution. I was no longer just a betrayed wife. I was a commanding general overseeing a tactical strike. The estate around me was quiet. Derek was still asleep in the guest room, exhausted from his triumphant performance at the Alto Lake mansion the night before. He believed he had won. He believed the forged asset separation and liability assumption agreement, signed with my disappearing ink pen, had legally transferred 60% of my empire into his greedy hands. He was resting easy, confident that his impending federal embezzlement charges would be magically erased by my stolen equity. I picked up my phone and opened the banking portal that controlled the automated transfers to Derek's accounts. For 10 years, I had quietly subsidized his illusion of grandeur. I had paid for the tailored suits, the imported cars, Vivian's country club memberships, and Terrence's endless string of failed business ventures. I navigated to the central funding hub and located the master switch. With a single decisive tap on the screen, I disabled the automated transfers. I did not stop there. I initiated a total freeze on every joint account, revoking Derek's access to the massive lines of credit he relied upon to function. The digital vault slammed shut, severing the financial umbilical cord that kept his entire family alive. Next, I opened a direct communication channel with my private legal team at Aegis Financial Technologies. I drafted a swift, merciless series of directives. First, the Alto Lake Mansion. Because the property was held under an LLC, registered entirely in my maiden name, I had full authority to revoke access. I instructed my lead counsel to immediately issue a formal notice of trespassing to Vivian, Terrence, and any unauthorized guests currently residing on the property. I scheduled a private security firm to arrive at the estate by noon on Sunday to enforce the eviction. Vivian wanted to host her judgmental sorority sisters and the pastor's family for a glamorous weekend retreat. She was about to host them on the front lawn while my security team locked the massive iron gates behind her. Then I turned my attention to Terrence. The commercial lease agreement for his phantom luxury automotive showroom was sitting on my desk waiting for my guarantor's signature. He had threatened to have Vivian revoke my high society memberships if I did not back his $800,000 pipe dream. I pulled the document toward me, picked up a standard black pen, and drew a massive, jagged line through the signature box. I attached a formal letter from my legal department, completely withdrawing any association with Terrence's business entities and explicitly citing his lack of verifiable assets. I overnighted the rejection directly to the commercial property landlords, ensuring Terrence would be hit with immediate default penalties and blacklisted from ever leasing in the Buckhead district again. Finally, there was Camille, my best friend, the woman who had smiled in my face while wearing my stolen $45,000 diamond and sapphire necklace. I compiled the original purchase receipts, the certificate of authenticity, and the fraudulent police report Derek had filed claiming the necklace was stolen during a burglary. I attached the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Camille wearing the jewelry at the Capitol Grill and at the Alto Lake party. I forwarded the entire packet to the Atlanta Police Department's Grand Larceny Division, officially naming Camille as a suspect in the possession of stolen property and insurance fraud. She wanted to play the glamorous mistress. She was about to play the glamorous defendant. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the monitors. The traps were set, the dominoes were perfectly aligned. Now it was time to coordinate the final devastating blow with Donovan. I opened a secure encrypted messaging application and typed a single sentence to the founder of Sterling Capital. The board is set. Awaiting Monday protocol. Donovan's reply arrived less than a minute later. Auditors are briefed. The cage drops at 9 a.m. Happy hunting. I closed the laptop and stood up, smoothing the front of my silk robe. The silence of the house felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a woman shrinking herself to protect her husband's fragile ego. It was the sharp, expectant silence before a detonation. I walked out of my office and glided down the sweeping staircase toward the kitchen. I began brewing a pot of expensive artisanal coffee, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. 10 minutes later, Derek strolled into the kitchen, wearing silk pajama pants and a deeply satisfied smirk. He looked like a man who had conquered the world. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, walking up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. He pressed a kiss to my neck, completely unaware that he was embracing his executioner. "Last night was incredible. You really made me the proudest man in Atlanta." I turned around holding my coffee mug and offered him a soft, adoring smile. "You deserve it, Derek," I replied, my voice dripping with sugary compliance. "You have worked so hard to manage everything. I just want you to have exactly what you have earned." His chest puffed out, inflating with the toxic arrogance that would soon be his undoing. "We are going to reach new heights, Serena," he boasted, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "With your assets shielded under sterling capital, I can maneuver us into a completely different tax bracket. We are going to be untouchable." I took a slow sip of my coffee, hiding the cold amusement dancing in my eyes. "I have no doubt about that," I murmured. The rest of the weekend played out like a surreal, slow-motion theatrical performance. I packed a small overnight bag, telling Derek I needed to spend Sunday at a luxury spa retreat to decompress from the stress of my supposed corporate liabilities. He eagerly encouraged me to go, likely thrilled to have the house to himself, so he could celebrate his fraudulent victory with Camille. As my driver navigated the Maybach out of Chastain Park, my phone began to vibrate violently in my purse. I glanced at the screen. It was Vivian. The security team had arrived at Alto Lake. I ignored the call. A few seconds later, a text message flashed across the screen. "Serena, there are armed guards at the lake house. They are telling my guests to leave. Derek is not answering his phone. Fix this immediately." I smiled, locking the screen and tossing the phone back into my purse. The eviction was underway. Vivian's grand illusion was currently shattering in front of the Buckhead Women's Coalition, exposing her as a fraud, who did not even own the property she was parading around in. The humiliation would be absolute, visceral, and permanent. I spent Sunday in perfect serenity, completely disconnected from the chaos erupting in my wake. I knew Terrence was likely receiving frantic calls from his commercial landlords. I knew Camille was sitting in her apartment, completely unaware that detectives were building a grand larceny case against her. And I knew Derek was furiously trying to use his frozen credit cards, completely oblivious to the fact that his financial oxygen had been permanently cut off. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, crisp clarity of a guillotine blade dropping. I did not go to my corporate office. Instead, I directed my driver to park across the street from the towering glass skyscraper that housed Sterling Capital. I sat in the back of the Maybach, sipping a fresh espresso, my eyes fixed on the grand entrance of the investment firm. The digital clock on the dashboard read 8:55 a.m. Deep within the servers of Sterling Capital, the Project Apex algorithm was silently counting down. Derek was likely sitting in his corner office preparing to casually deploy the code that generated 80% of the firm's revenue. He was likely preparing to finalize the transfer of my forged equity to replace the $2.5 million he had embezzled. At exactly 9 a.m., I pulled out my encrypted tablet and accessed the dormant failsafe protocol I had embedded in my intellectual property. I did not hesitate. I initiated the kill switch. A tiny green confirmation light blinked on my screen. Project Apex was officially dead. The algorithm locked itself, shutting down all predictive trading across Sterling Capital's network and sealing the backend behind an impenetrable cryptographic wall. Inside the skyscraper, absolute panic would be setting in. Traders would be screaming at their monitors. Executives would be demanding answers. Derek would be staring at a red error screen, completely incapable of bypassing a security protocol he did not write and did not understand. The dashboard clock ticked to 9:15 a.m. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Donovan. "System is down. He is sweating through his custom suit." I just called him into my office. I leaned back, watching the glass doors of the building. Inside Donovan's office, Derek was walking into his final nightmare. He was about to hand Donovan the forged asset separation document, only to discover the ink had completely vanished, leaving him with a blank piece of paper. He was about to realize he had no equity to steal, no algorithm to control, and no money to replace the millions he had embezzled. And then Donovan was going to hand him the audit. At 9:45 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled up sharply in front of the Sterling Capitol building. Men wearing dark windbreakers with the unmistakable yellow letters of the FBI printed across the back stepped out and moved swiftly through the revolving glass doors. I rolled down the tinted window of the Maybach, letting the cool morning air hit my face. 15 minutes later, the FBI agents emerged. Walking between them, his hands securely cuffed behind his back, was Derek. His face was completely drained of color, his arrogant posture shattered into a display of absolute pathetic terror. He looked wildly around the street, a man who had suddenly realized he had lost everything. His eyes swept across the traffic and locked directly onto my Maybach. I did not break eye contact. I slowly raised my espresso cup, offering him a silent, perfectly executed toast. Derek's mouth fell open in a silent scream of realization just before the agents shoved him into the back of the federal vehicle. The SUV sped away, sirens blaring, carrying the ruins of my husband off to federal prison. I tapped the glass partition, signaling my driver. "Take me to the office," I commanded, rolling the window back up. "The garbage has been collected. It is time to get back to work." Donovan reached for his bourbon, taking a slow sip as he evaluated my immediate acceptance of his proposal. "You are remarkably composed for a woman who just discovered her husband is a multi-million-dollar felon." He noted, his eyes narrowing in calculated assessment. Most spouses presented with this portfolio would be in hysterics, demanding immediate retaliation or breaking down in tears. "Hysterics are for people who lack leverage, Donovan," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And while I appreciate the extensive audit you have conducted on Derek's embezzlement and the evidence you have gathered, I need you to understand something very clearly before we proceed. You are operating under the assumption that you hold the ultimate power in this room. You do not. I do." Donovan raised a single eyebrow. His amusement was evident, but guarded, reflecting the instincts of a man who rarely encountered genuine defiance. "Is that so, Serena? I am the one holding the federal evidence that can vaporize his entire existence. I am the one who controls his corporate standing at Sterling Capital. It seems to me that I am handing you the sword to slay your dragon." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table, letting the ambient noise of the VIP lounge fade away. "Let us talk about Sterling Capital's quarterly earnings," I said softly, shifting the conversation onto his territory. "Specifically, let us talk about the proprietary predictive trading algorithm that currently generates 80% of your firm's annual profit margins. The high-frequency system Derek conveniently named Project Apex." Donovan's amusement vanished instantly. His posture stiffened and the casual confidence he had brought into the room evaporated. "Project Apex is the crown jewel of our trading floor," he stated, his voice losing its relaxed cadence and dropping into a defensive chill. "Derek developed that code 5 years ago. It is the only reason the executive board and I tolerated his arrogant behavior and his exorbitant expense accounts for so long. That algorithm revolutionized our market positioning. It is the absolute lifeblood of Sterling Capital." I pulled my encrypted tablet from my designer clutch and placed it flat on the table between us. I tapped the screen, bypassing the biometric security firewall, and opened a heavily redacted digital legal vault. I selected a master file and slid the device across the smooth surface toward him. "Derek did not write a single line of that code, Donovan," I said, watching the color slowly drain from the powerful billionaire's face as his eyes scanned the digital document. "Derek barely knows how to format a basic financial spreadsheet, let alone architect a quantum-level high-frequency trading algorithm. I wrote Project Apex. I coded the entire foundational framework in a cramped apartment 10 years ago, entirely under my maiden name, before Derek and I were even married." Donovan stared at the screen, completely paralyzed. The document displayed on the tablet was an irrevocable intellectual property registration filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The owner of the algorithm was listed as a private holding company. The sole proprietor of that holding company was Serena Davis, my maiden name. "When we were first married, Derek was struggling to meet his quotas at your firm," I explained, keeping my tone strictly informational. "His pride was fracturing. To help him succeed, I allowed him to use a beta version of my algorithm to optimize his personal client portfolios. I thought I was helping my husband build a solid career. Instead, he quietly took my proprietary code, presented it to your board as his own creation, and forged a fraudulent licensing agreement between my blind trust and Sterling Capital." Donovan looked up from the tablet, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "You own the code," he whispered, the implications hitting him with the force of a freight train. "You own the underlying architecture that runs Sterling Capital." "I own every single line of it," I confirmed, nodding slowly. Derek has been illegally licensing my intellectual property to your firm for 5 years. Sterling Capital has been generating billions of dollars in profit using stolen software. If I initiate the kill switch on that algorithm tonight, your entire trading floor goes completely dark by tomorrow morning. Your predictive models will crash. Your automated escrow accounts will freeze. The silence that followed was suffocating. The power dynamic in the secluded leather booth had violently inverted. Minutes earlier, Donovan thought he was the apex predator, offering a lifeline to a betrayed wife. Now he realized he was sitting across from the woman who possessed the nuclear codes to his entire financial empire. If I chose to unleash my legal team, I could hit Sterling Capital with the largest intellectual property lawsuit in corporate history, effectively bankrupting his firm and sending his wealthy investors running for the hills. You could destroy my company, Donovan stated, stating a simple, undisputed fact. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He merely acknowledged the lethal trap he had unwittingly walked into. I could. I agreed smoothly, retrieving my tablet and slipping it back into my clutch, but I have absolutely no interest in destroying Sterling Capital. My war is not with you, Donovan. You are a businessman protecting your assets, and I am a chief executive protecting mine. My war is exclusively with Derek and the parasitic family that has gorged themselves on my unseen labor for a decade. Donovan exhaled a long, slow breath, the tension in his shoulders releasing slightly. What are your terms, Serena? Name your price. I leaned back, mirroring his earlier relaxed posture. We are going to strike a ruthless, mutually beneficial pact. I outlined, my voice echoing with pure strategic execution. First, Sterling Capital will sign a legitimate exclusive licensing agreement directly with my holding company for the continued use of Project Apex. You will pay a premium corporate rate for the algorithm, but your firm will remain completely intact and insulated from any legal liability regarding Derek's previous forgery. Your business operations will not experience a single second of downtime. Done, Donovan agreed immediately, recognizing the sheer mercy of the offer. And in exchange, you give me Derek, I said, my eyes hardening into dark obsidian. I want unrestricted access to your entire forensic audit. I want every wire transfer log, every dummy shell company record, and every piece of evidence detailing his $2.5 million embezzlement scheme. But more importantly, Donovan, I want absolute control over the timing of his execution. Donovan narrowed his eyes, studying me with profound professional respect. You want to drop the federal indictment on your own schedule. You want to choose the exact moment the FBI kicks down his door. Derek currently believes he has successfully tricked me into signing away 60% of my financial technology empire, I explained, recalling the grand performance at the Alto Lake Mansion. He thinks my equity is going to magically cover the millions he stole from your vault. I am going to let him believe he has won. I am going to let him submit that forged asset separation agreement to his corporate lawyers. I am going to let him and his mistress celebrate their massive victory. I want them to climb to the absolute highest peak of their arrogance, because the higher they climb, the more devastating the impact will be when I completely shatter their reality. A dark, predatory smile slowly returned to Donovan's face. He reached out and picked up his glass of bourbon, raising it slightly in the air. You are a terrifying woman, Serena. Derek has absolutely no idea what kind of monster he invited into his life. I clinked my glass of sparkling water against his bourbon. I am not a monster, Donovan. I am just a woman taking out the trash. We spent the next 2 hours in the VIP lounge mapping out the precise logistical sequence of the strike. The alliance was perfect. Donovan would get his stolen capital returned through the liquidation of Derek's personal assets, and he would get the satisfaction of seeing a rogue director thrown into a federal penitentiary. I would secure a highly lucrative corporate contract for my algorithm and gain the ultimate weapon to legally annihilate my husband's existence. When I finally walked out of the Sovereign Club, the humid night air of Atlanta felt incredibly refreshing. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my matte black Maybach to be brought around to the front. The war room planning was complete. The nuclear option was fully secured. Now all that was left was to let the rats feast on the poison bait. Over the next 48 hours, I watched the absolute chaos of their unearned arrogance unfold with silent clinical detachment, I went about my daily routine maintaining the flawless facade of the supportive oblivious wife. I answered Vivian's demanding text messages about floral arrangements. I politely declined Terrence's calls regarding his commercial lease, pretending I was simply busy with administrative delays. I smiled at Derek over morning coffee, listening to him enthusiastically talk about how the new asset separation was going to secure our financial future. Behind my serene mask, I was meticulously monitoring their digital footprints, watching them sprint recklessly toward the edge of a cliff. Believing the forged contract had officially transferred my billion-dollar empire into his control, Derek went on an absolute spending spree. Through my hidden access to his financial routing data, I watched him authorize a massive $2 million wire transfer to a luxury marine brokerage in Miami. He had purchased a custom-designed 80-foot yacht. But the true insult was buried in the ownership documentation. He did not register the vessel under his name or a corporate trust. He registered the $2 million yacht directly in Camille's name. It was the ultimate victory gift to his mistress, bought and paid for with the phantom wealth he believed he had just stolen from me. Not to be outdone by his older brother Terrence threw caution entirely to the wind. Convinced that my signature was securely on his commercial lease guarantor documents, he marched into a prominent Buckhead real estate office and finalized a $100,000 non-refundable deposit for his luxury automotive showroom. He billed the staggering deposit directly to one of my corporate routing numbers, fully expecting the funds to clear without a single question asked. He had already begun posting cryptic, inspirational quotes on his social media accounts, bragging about becoming Atlanta's newest automotive titan. But the most spectacular display of delusion came from my mother-in-law. On Wednesday afternoon, Vivian attended a highly publicized charity luncheon hosted by the Buckhead Women's Coalition. The event was held in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel, packed with the most influential and gossipy women in the city. Through a mutual acquaintance who sat at Vivian's table, I received a real-time audio recording of her magnificent performance. "My Derek is finally taking total control of the family assets," Vivian announced loudly, her voice cutting through the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, ensuring everyone at the table could hear her. "Serena is a sweet girl, but she is entirely useless when it comes to high-level corporate finance. She was driving her little tech startup straight into bankruptcy. Derek had to legally step in and absorb her company just to save her from going to federal prison." I listened to the audio recording through my AirPods, sitting quietly in my corporate office. The sheer audacity of her lies was almost impressive. But the real blessing, Vivian continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that was deliberately loud enough to carry, is that Derek is finally preparing to evict her. Once the asset transfer clears, he is moving her out of the Alto Lake estate permanently. He has finally realized he needs a woman who truly matches his pedigree. Someone elegant, someone like Camille. I paused the recording, pulling the AirPods from my ears and setting them on my desk. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my office, watching the Atlanta skyline shimmer in the afternoon sun. Vivian was publicly bragging to the most powerful women in the city that her son was evicting me to marry my best friend. She was laying the social groundwork for my complete humiliation, entirely convinced that Derek was the master of the universe. Terrence was signing non-refundable corporate deposits with money that did not exist. Derek was buying luxury yachts for a woman who was currently being investigated by the Atlanta Police Department for grand larceny. They were gorging themselves on a feast of pure delusion. They were swallowing the poison bait whole, savoring every single bite. I did not say a word. I did not send a single angry text message. I did not shed a single tear. I simply sat behind my black walnut desk reviewing the disappearing ink evaporation timeline on my encrypted terminal. The ink on the asset separation agreement had officially vanished, leaving Derek holding nothing but an empty, worthless piece of paper. The federal embezzlement file from Donovan was securely locked in my digital vault, ready to be deployed to the FBI the moment I gave the command. The slaughter was imminent. All I had to do was wait for them to look down and realize the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. The digital execution began precisely at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning. I sat alone in the reinforced glass conference room on the top floor of the Aegis Financial Technologies Tower. The city below was still draped in the early morning fog, but my mind was operating with razor-sharp clarity. Derek had spent the past year quietly burrowing into my corporate ecosystem. He had exploited his status as my husband to manipulate my IT administrators and bypass low-level security clearances. He thought he was a phantom moving silently through my servers to monitor my company's valuation and prepare for his hostile takeover. He believed he had successfully woven his digital tendrils into the very fabric of my empire. It was time to pull the plug and plunge him into absolute darkness. I logged into the master administrative console of the Aegis network. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard protocols and accessing the foundational architecture of the company. I pulled up Derek's hidden profile. He had created a shadow account masking his IP address to mirror my own executive credentials. I highlighted the entire shadow network he had built. With a single keystroke, I revoked every clearance level he possessed. I deleted his biometric access codes. I wiped his encrypted passwords. I initiated an automated firewall protocol that would instantly flag and block any device attempting to connect from his personal MAC addresses. The satisfaction of watching his digital footprint vanish from my screen was immensely gratifying. Derek was now completely locked out. If he tried to log into the Aegis servers to check the status of his fraudulent equity transfer, he would be met with a blaring red access denied screen. He would have absolutely no way to verify his theft and no way to monitor my company's internal communications. He was flying entirely blind, unaware that his compass had just been smashed. With my corporate borders securely fortified, I moved to the second phase of the strike. I opened a secure video conference with my primary wealth manager at our private banking institution. Marcus was a discreet, seasoned professional who had managed my anonymous holding companies for years with absolute precision. He appeared on my screen, sitting in his immaculate mahogany office looking perfectly attentive. "Good morning, Serena," Marcus said, his tone professional and crisp. "How can we assist you today?" "Marcus, I need you to initiate a total lockdown on all joint accounts associated with Derek." I instructed, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Suspend the domestic checking accounts, freeze the offshore trust, and place an immediate hard hold on every single platinum credit card issued under his name. I want all overdraft protections revoked and all automated transfers permanently canceled." Marcus did not blink. He simply nodded his hands, moving rapidly across his own keyboard. "The freeze is initiated, Serena. The accounts are now locked. Any pending transactions will be declined, and any cards swiped will return a hard rejection." "Excellent," I replied. "Now we need to address a specific fraudulent charge attempting to clear my corporate routing network." I transmitted the digital copy of the commercial lease agreement Terrence had dropped on my desk. My foolish brother-in-law had actually believed I would guarantee an $800,000 commercial lease for his phantom luxury automotive showroom. He had rushed to the commercial real estate office and finalized a $100,000 non-refundable deposit, billing it directly to my corporate account numbers. He had proudly signed his own name on the master lease contract, completely blinded by his unearned arrogance and his desperation to play the role of a wealthy entrepreneur. "Terrence has attempted to process a $100,000 deposit using unauthorized corporate routing credentials," I explained to Marcus. "I want that transaction explicitly flagged as fraudulent. You are to deny the transfer and immediately notify the receiving bank that the funds were requested using stolen account information." "Understood," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the document on his screen. "The receiving bank will automatically reverse the provisional credit. The commercial landlords will be notified that the deposit has bounced due to fraud." A cold smile touched my lips. Because Terrence had signed the master lease agreement under his own personal limited liability company, he was legally bound by the terms of the contract. The landlords of the Buckhead Commercial District were notoriously ruthless. The moment that $100,000 deposit bounced, they would immediately hit Terrence with massive default penalties. They would file a breach of contract lawsuit against him personally. Terrence had zero liquid assets of his own. He lived entirely off the allowance Derek fed him from my accounts. Without my money to cover the deposit, Terrence was now personally liable for a massive commercial debt. He had eagerly walked straight into a financial bear trap, and I had just snapped its steel jaws shut around his ankles. He was going to be buried in legal fees and blacklisted by every major commercial real estate broker in the state of Georgia. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, closing the video conference. The financial oxygen supply to my husband's family had officially been severed. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking over to the sleek espresso machine in the corner of the room. The morning was progressing perfectly. Derek was locked out of the corporate network. Terrence was about to be financially ruined by his own commercial lease. But the most devastating piece of the silent preparation was yet to come. It was time to deal with the Alto Lake mansion. I poured myself a fresh cup of espresso and returned to my desk. Waiting for me in a heavy manila folder was a stack of property deeds and legal transfer documents prepared by my personal real estate attorney. Vivian had proudly declared to the Buckhead Women's Coalition that Derek was preparing to evict me and move Camille into the $4.5 million estate. She had planned to use the property as the ultimate symbol of her family's undisputed dominance. She genuinely believed she was the matriarch of an elite dynasty, and that the Alto Lake mansion was her personal kingdom. She had no idea that the property was held exclusively under an LLC, registered in my maiden name. She had no idea that I held the absolute legal authority to dispose of the estate however I saw fit. I opened the manila folder and reviewed the primary deed of transfer. I was not going to sell the house. Selling it would take months of inspections, appraisals, and quiet negotiations. I wanted immediate, undeniable destruction. I wanted to execute a move that would not only evict Vivian, but would completely humiliate her in front of the high society peers she worshipped so desperately. I picked up my heavy gold-plated Montblanc pen. This time, I was not using disappearing ink. This ink was permanent black and legally binding. I signed my name on the grantee line, officially transferring the absolute ownership of the $4.5 million Alto Lake mansion to the Atlanta Women and Children's Safe Haven. It was one of the city's largest and most respected charitable organizations, dedicated exclusively to providing emergency housing rehabilitation and resources for homeless women escaping domestic abuse and poverty. The poetic justice of the transfer was exquisite. Vivian despised the poor. She spent her entire life stepping over people she deemed inferior, terrified that associating with anyone outside her elite tax bracket would tarnish her precious social standing. She hosted lavish charity galas solely for the photo opportunities, viewing actual charity work as a distasteful inconvenience. Now the sprawling, luxurious estate she had tried to claim as her own, the very property Derek had fraudulently attempted to gift to Camille, was legally owned by a homeless charity. I attached a signed addendum to the deed transfer, instructing my legal team to personally deliver the keys and the deed to the charity's board of directors by the end of the day. The addendum explicitly granted the charity immediate full access to the property and authorized them to begin moving their operations and their residents onto the estate by the weekend. Vivian was planning to host her exclusive sorority sisters for a glamorous lakeside retreat. Instead, she was going to arrive at the gates to find a fleet of charity vans unloading boxes and dozens of displaced women setting up temporary residence in her precious master suite. The sheer magnitude of the public embarrassment would completely obliterate Vivian's social standing. She would be exposed as a penniless fraud evicted from a house she never owned, surrounded by the very people she had spent her life looking down upon. The Buckhead Women's Coalition would never let her live down the humiliation. Her reign as the queen of Atlanta's black elite was over. I finished signing the final notary documents and placed them back into the manila folder. I sealed the envelope and handed it to my executive assistant, who had just walked into the office. "Have the legal department courier this directly to the Safe Haven Board of Directors," I instructed, my voice perfectly calm. "Tell them the deed is clear, the property taxes are prepaid for the next 5 years, and they are authorized to take immediate possession of the estate." My assistant nodded, taking the heavy envelope and quietly exiting the room. I walked back over to the floor to ceiling glass windows looking out over the sprawling expanse of Atlanta. The sun was now fully illuminating the city, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete and steel. The invisible counterattack was fully deployed. Every trap had been set. Every exit had been boarded up and nailed shut. Derek, Terrence, Vivian, and Camille had spent years treating my life as an all-you-can-eat buffet. They had taken my grace for weakness, my silence for ignorance, and my generosity for an endless, limitless entitlement. They had conspired to steal my empire, my home, and my dignity. They had gorged themselves on my unseen labor, completely unaware that I was the chef who had poisoned the feast. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, absolute power radiating through my veins. The preparation was complete. The execution was already in motion. All that was left to do was sit back, watch the financial and social implosion, and listen to the beautiful, deafening sound of their entire world collapsing into dust. Friday evening arrived with a chilling perfection. The annual Atlanta Excellence Gala was widely considered the absolute pinnacle of the city's social and corporate calendar. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel was transformed into a breathtaking spectacle draped in thousands of crystal chandeliers and imported white orchids. 500 of the most influential figures in finance, politics, and high society were gathered in their finest black tie attire. Tonight was supposed to be Derek's ultimate crowning moment. He was scheduled to receive the highly coveted Businessman of the Year award, a distinction that would solidify his false image as a titan of industry. I had told Derek I was delayed at my corporate office dealing with a massive server glitch. I assured him I would arrive just before his award presentation. Liberated by my supposed absence, Derek had brazenly taken the opportunity to rearrange the seating at the primary VIP table located directly in front of the stage. He proudly seated Vivian, Terrence, and Camille in the center of the room. The sheer audacity of his entitlement was staggering. From my hidden vantage point in the shadows of the elevated mezzanine balcony, I looked down at the slaughterhouse. I wore a backless emerald silk evening gown, grasping a crystal glass of sparkling water and watching them gorge themselves on their final meal of false superiority. At the VIP table, Vivian was holding court. She spoke loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the ambient jazz music, boasting to the elite women around her about her son's brilliant corporate maneuvers. She proudly declared that Derek was finally preparing to shed his deadweight wife for a woman of actual class. Beside her, Terrence was aggressively swirling an expensive glass of cognac, bragging to local real estate investors about the Buckhead showroom he believed he had successfully leased. He was completely unaware that his deposit had bounced and that a breach of contract lawsuit was already heading toward his mailbox. And then there was Camille. She sat gracefully beside Derek wearing a tailored crimson gown and displaying my $45,000 diamond and sapphire necklace against her collarbone. She laughed at Derek's jokes, playing the role of the devoted, supportive partner, perfectly oblivious to the grand larceny warrant that the Atlanta Police Department was currently finalizing against her. They looked like royalty, untouchable and triumphant. They were completely unaware that the guillotine blade had already been released and was currently plunging toward their necks. The ambient music slowly faded as the master of ceremonies, a prominent local news anchor, stepped up to the acrylic podium on the main stage. The grand ballroom quieted as 500 guests took their seats. The MC spoke highly of Derek's supposed innovations at Sterling Capital, attributing the massive success of the firm's trading algorithms directly to his financial genius. From the VIP table, Vivian dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, soaking in the reflected glory. Camille smiled adoringly up at Derek, her hand resting lightly on his velvet tuxedo jacket. When Derek's name was finally called, the ballroom erupted into a wave of polite, wealthy applause. Derek stood up, adjusting his diamond cufflinks. He kissed his mother on the cheek, gave his brother a firm handshake, and offered Camille a lingering, intimate squeeze on the shoulder before strutting up the carpeted stairs to the stage. He approached the microphone, gripping the edges of the podium with a blinding white smile. He looked out over the sea of elite guests, soaking in their admiration. He truly believed he was the undisputed king of Atlanta. "Thank you, Derek," said his deep voice, echoing beautifully through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Success in this industry is never a solo endeavor. It takes vision, ruthless execution, and most importantly, a circle of trust that supports you when you make the hardest decisions of your life." He paused, letting the profound hypocrisy of his words wash over the audience before gesturing toward the massive 40-foot projection screen suspended behind the stage. The event organizers had requested a highlight reel representing a carefully edited montage of Derek's corporate triumphs and philanthropic endeavors. What the organizers did not know was that my private tech team had intercepted the audiovisual feed an hour before the gala began. "Let us take a look at what true dedication looks like," Derek announced, turning to watch the screen. The magnificent crystal chandeliers dimmed to pitch black. A hushed anticipation fell over the crowd. The massive screen flickered to life. It was not a corporate montage accompanied by uplifting instrumental music. It was the high-resolution video I had recorded from the dark alcove at the Capitol Grill. The footage was blown up to massive cinematic proportions, displaying Derek and Camille sitting intimately in the plush leather booth. The camera lens was perfectly stabilized, capturing the ambient restaurant lighting and the undeniable reality of their deceit. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the 500 guests. They recognized Derek. They recognized Camille sitting at the VIP table. Then the audio kicked in. I had run the file through an audio enhancement software, filtering out the background jazz and isolating their voices with crystal-clear precision. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as Derek leaned across the table and passionately kissed his wife's best friend. Gasps echoed through the dark room. I looked down at the VIP table from my balcony. Vivian's champagne glass slipped from her manicured hand and shattered violently against the marble floor. But a simple affair was not enough to destroy a man in this circle. Infidelity was common gossip. Federal fraud was a permanent exile. The video on the massive screen continued to play without mercy. The entire ballroom watched as Derek reached down and pulled the thick, bright red folder from his designer briefcase. He laid it flat on the table, pushing aside the water glasses. "This is the deed to the Alto Lake mansion." Derek's recorded voice boomed through the ballroom speakers, loud and damning. "I forged her signature this morning. It is officially yours, Camille. The lake house is under your name now." The polite silence in the ballroom evaporated instantly, replaced by a wave of vocal shock and revulsion. Men in expensive tailored suits stared at the stage in absolute disgust. Women covered their mouths in horror, looking directly at Camille, who was shrinking into her chair. On the projection screen, Camille leaned in, admiring the forged paperwork, her fingers grazing my diamond necklace around her throat. "It gets better," Derek's voice boasted from the speakers, echoing with sickening arrogance. "The asset separation agreement is ready. I replicated her corporate seals. By next week, I will have 60% of her tech company transferred to my offshore holding account. We are going to bleed her completely dry. She will never see it coming. She is too busy trusting me." The video froze, freezing on a high-definition close-up of Derek's smug, smiling face as he handed the forged legal documents to his mistress. The lights in the grand ballroom violently snapped back on, blindingly bright. Derek stood completely frozen behind the acrylic podium. He was gripping the edges of the stand so hard his knuckles had turned stark white. His jaw was slung open, his eyes wide with a level of primal sheer terror I had never seen before. The suave, confident businessman of the year had been instantly reduced to a cornered animal, staring out at an audience that was looking at him like he was a diseased rat. He looked desperately at the audiovisual booth, waving his hands frantically, but the technicians were locked out of the system. At the VIP table, the destruction was equally absolute. Vivian was hyperventilating, clutching her chest, as the elite women she had spent decades trying to impress stared down at her with undisguised contempt. The sorority sisters she had planned to host at the lake house were now whispering furiously, pointing at her and leaning away in disgust. Terrence was slumped in his chair, looking frantically around the room, realizing that his golden goose had just been publicly slaughtered. Camille had buried her face in her hands, trying to hide behind her crimson gown as camera flashes from the local media began to erupt throughout the room. I stepped out of the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, walking slowly to the edge of the glass railing. The emerald silk of my gown caught the light as I looked down at the spectacular wreckage of their lives. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply let the absolute silence of my authority radiate through the room. Several guests near the balcony looked up and saw me standing there, perfectly composed, perfectly serene, watching my husband burn to ashes. Then Derek looked up. His eyes met mine across the massive expanse of the ballroom. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He finally realized that the helpless, trusting wife he thought he was stealing from had actually been the architect of his demise. The trap had snapped entirely shut on the grandest stage possible. There was no spinning this narrative. There was no public relations firm expensive enough or connected enough to erase the high-definition broadcast of a man cheerfully confessing to forging federal documents and plotting the financial assassination of his own wife. Derek was ruined. His reputation within the Atlanta financial sector was incinerated in front of 500 witnesses. The ballroom erupted into complete chaos. Reporters were shouting questions at the stage. Board members of the Excellence Gala were rushing the podium to forcefully escort Derek away from the microphone. Security guards were swarming the VIP table as Vivian began to wail hysterically, demanding that someone fix the screen. I turned away from the glass railing, my face completely devoid of pity. I picked up my clutch and walked toward the private exit of the mezzanine. The social execution was a flawless victory, but it was merely the appetizer. The real devastation was waiting for them outside the doors of the Four Seasons. They had gorged themselves on my empire for a decade, and now the bill had finally arrived. But I could not let the hotel event staff hand them the check. I needed to deliver the itemized receipt myself. I turned on my heel, the heavy emerald silk of my evening gown sweeping elegantly across the polished mezzanine floor. I bypassed the private exit doors I had originally planned to use and moved deliberately toward the grand curved staircase that cascaded directly down into the center of the main ballroom. The descent was a masterclass in slow psychological tension. As my crystal heels clicked rhythmically against the marble steps, the panicked shouting and chaotic murmurs in the ballroom began to die down. 500 guests, influential politicians, wealthy socialites, and ruthless corporate raiders turned their undivided attention toward the staircase. The crowd physically parted for me, creating a wide, unobstructed aisle straight to the main stage. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror, recognizing the architect of the devastating broadcast. I did not break my stride. I glided through the center of the room, keeping my posture impeccably straight and my chin held high. I walked up the carpeted steps of the stage. Derek was still completely frozen behind the clear acrylic podium. Sweat was pouring down his ashen face, ruining his crisp, tailored collar. His chest heaved erratically. He looked like a mannequin caught in a harsh, blinding spotlight, unable to form a single coherent word or process the destruction of his reality. I stepped up right beside him. The faint, familiar smell of his expensive cologne made my stomach turn, but my expression remained an icy, flawless mask of absolute composure. I reached out and gently pried the microphone from his rigid, white-knuckled grip. He did not resist. He simply stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his arrogance completely evaporated. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp, crisp sound echoed like a gunshot through the dead silent ballroom, commanding total attention. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calibrated, filling the massive room with chilling clarity. "I apologize for the unconventional entertainment tonight. It seems my husband wanted to share his visionary business strategies with all of you. But since he is currently at a loss for words, allow me to clarify his brilliant corporate maneuvers." I turned slowly to look Derek directly in the eyes. The microphone picked up my voice, amplifying the lethal calmness of my tone. "You really thought you outsmarted me, Derek?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You thought you could slide a forged asset separation agreement across my desk at a crowded party and steal 60% of my life's work? You thought you were an untouchable mastermind pulling the strings of my empire." Derek's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. He was choking on his own hubris. "You are a terrible thief," I stated flatly, refusing to break eye contact. "The custom luxury pen you used to sign those documents at the Alto Lake mansion was filled with a highly specialized, evaporating ink. By the time you proudly submitted that contract to your corporate lawyers and the Internal Revenue Service, the pages were completely blank. You handed them a stack of empty, worthless paper." A collective gasp rippled through the elite audience. Derek physically staggered backward as the realization slammed into him, bracing himself against the podium to keep from collapsing. "You have absolutely no equity, Derek!" I continued, raising my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the room absorbed his monumental failure. "You have no algorithm. Project Apex is permanently locked, and your entire trading floor is currently sitting in the dark, bleeding money. But while your asset separation contract evaporated, the digital trail of your $2.5 million embezzlement did not. Sterling Capital has completed a full forensic audit. Donovan and the executive board are completely aware of your theft. That contract you submitted to the IRS is blank, Derek. But the FBI is very interested in your forged signatures on those offshore wire transfers. Your career is over. Your freedom is over. The federal authorities are already preparing your cell." Derek crumpled, dropping heavily to his knees behind the podium, as if his spine had been completely severed. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly. I stepped around him, refusing to give him another second of my attention or an ounce of pity. I walked to the very edge of the stage, looking down at the VIP table situated directly in front of me. The spotlight hit the table, illuminating the absolute suffocating panic on the faces of my parasitic in-laws. Vivian was clutching her chest, gasping for air, as her wealthy socialite friends scooted their chairs violently away from her, treating her like she carried a highly contagious disease. "Mother Vivian," I said, addressing her with chilling formality, "I heard your wonderful confident announcement at the charity luncheon on Wednesday. You were bragging to the entire Buckhead Women's Coalition about evicting me from the Alto Lake estate so your son could move his mistress into my home." Vivian shook her head frantically, her elaborate updo trembling and falling out of place. "Serena, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking pitifully. "It was just a misunderstanding. I did not mean it." "There is no misunderstanding," I replied, my voice ringing like a judge reading a final inescapable sentence. "That mansion is owned strictly by a holding LLC, registered entirely in my maiden name. I hold the absolute legal authority over the property. Mother, the Alto Lake Mansion now belongs to a homeless charity. The commercial moving vans arrive tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp to begin converting the master suite into emergency housing. They move in tomorrow. You are officially trespassing on charitable property. If you are not off the premises by sunrise, you will be forcibly removed by private security and the local police. You wanted to host your judgmental sorority sisters for a glamorous lakeside retreat. Instead, you are going to be packing your bags in garbage bags on the front lawn in front of every wealthy neighbor in the district. I did not give her time to recover from the blow. I immediately shifted my gaze to Terrence, who was sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "And Terrence," I said, letting a sharp edge of mock pity enter my voice, "my ambitious, highly successful entrepreneurial brother-in-law. You really thought I would blindly guarantee an $800,000 commercial lease for a man who has never held a real job in his life. You threatened to ruin my social standing if I did not fund your pipe dream." Terrence swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table so tightly the tablecloth wrinkled. "Terrence, your $800,000 loan was denied," I announced clearly and deliberately, ensuring the real estate investors at the neighboring tables heard every word. "I completely withdrew my legal association with all your business entities. The deposit you rushed to finalize yesterday was flagged by my wealth manager and bounced as a completely fraudulent transaction. Because you proudly signed the master lease under your own personal limited liability company, you are now entirely liable for the massive breach of contract. The commercial landlords in Buckhead do not play games, Terrence. The bank is pursuing you for the $100,000 fraudulent deposit right now. You have absolutely zero liquid assets. You are going to be buried in default penalties and corporate legal fees for the rest of your natural life." Terrence buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic groan of sheer defeat. The entire VIP table was a scene of absolute devastation. But the grand finale was reserved for the woman sitting frozen at the end of the table. Camille had finally realized she was the last remaining target. Panic seized her entirely. She pushed her chair back violently, the wooden legs screeching harshly against the marble floor. She grabbed her designer clutch and hitched up her crimson gown, trying to flee toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom to escape the public slaughter. Not so fast, Camille. I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip through the premium sound system. The sheer undeniable authority in my tone made her freeze mid-step. She turned back to look at me, her face twisted in pure, undisguised terror. You wanted to play the role of the glamorous, supportive partner, I said, looking down at her from the elevated stage. You wanted to wear my clothes, drink my expensive wine, and sleep with my husband. You even wanted to wear my custom jewelry to the biggest corporate gala of the year, thinking you had finally replaced me. I pointed a single, perfectly manicured finger directly at her throat. That $45,000 diamond and sapphire necklace you are so proudly displaying tonight belongs to me. Camille gasped, her hands flying up to clutch the heavy jewels around her neck as if they had suddenly turned into burning coals. She fumbled desperately with the intricate clasp, trying to rip the necklace off her skin. Keep it on, Camille, I instructed coldly. It is the perfect accessory for a mugshot. You see, Derek filed a fraudulent police report claiming that necklace was stolen during a burglary to collect the insurance money. I provided the original purchase receipts, the certificates of authenticity, and high-resolution photographs of you wearing it to the Atlanta Police Department. The $45,000 diamond necklace you are wearing was reported stolen. Camille began to hyperventilate, backing away from the table and bumping into a waiter. Serena, you cannot do this, she pleaded, her voice echoing thinly and pitifully in the massive room. We were best friends. I am sorry. Best friends do not forge property deeds to steal each other's homes, I replied, devoid of any empathy whatsoever. I promised you that you would play a glamorous defendant, and I always keep my promises. If you look toward the main doors of the ballroom, you will see that police officers are waiting at the ballroom doors to arrest you for possession of stolen property. Every head in the 500-person ballroom swiveled toward the grand mahogany doors at the back of the venue. Standing there, illuminated by the hallway lights, were 4 uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department. They marched into the room, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the floor, moving with deliberate tactical purpose straight toward the VIP table. Camille let out a piercing, panicked shriek, trying to scramble backward, but she was completely surrounded by elite guests who refused to yield an inch to let her pass. The officers reached her, grabbing her arms firmly and swiftly turning her around. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. You are under arrest for possession of stolen property and grand larceny, one of the officers stated loudly, reading her Miranda rights, as he forcefully marched her away from the table. Camille sobbed hysterically, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face as she was paraded through the center aisle of the room in front of 500 of Atlanta's most influential citizens. The humiliation was total and absolute. I stood on the stage watching her being dragged out of the ballroom. I looked down at Vivian, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her linen napkin, rocking back and forth. I looked at Terrence, who was staring blankly at the floor, completely broken. Finally, I looked down at Derek, who was still kneeling on the floor behind the podium, a ruined, pathetic shell of a man, waiting for the federal agents to arrive and collect him. I placed the microphone gently back onto the acrylic stand. The soft click signaled the end of the execution. I smoothed the front of my emerald silk gown, turned my back on the spectacular wreckage of my former family, and walked gracefully down the stairs, leaving them to burn in the inferno they had built themselves. Before I could reach the bottom of the carpeted steps, a towering figure materialized from the shadows of the stage wings. It was Donovan. He walked with the relaxed, predatory stride of a man about to deliver the final killing blow. He stepped up to the acrylic podium flanking me and placed a heavy, authoritative hand on the microphone stand. The collective gasp of the audience sucked the remaining oxygen from the grand ballroom. Donovan looked down at Derek, who was still trembling on his knees. There has been a slight change to the evening's program, Donovan announced, his deep voice reverberating off the crystal chandeliers. Effective immediately, Derek is stripped of the Businessman of the Year award. Furthermore, his employment at Sterling Capital is officially terminated with cause. The elite crowd murmured in shock, but Donovan raised a hand for absolute silence. You see, Derek has been playing a dangerous game with Sterling Capital. Donovan continued his tone sharp and unforgiving. He embezzled $2.5 million from our corporate vaults to fund his pathetic illusion of grandeur. But his most spectacular deception was his claim to the Project Apex trading algorithm. Derek did not write a single line of that code, he stole it. That genius software, the absolute engine of our success, has always belonged entirely to Serena. A fresh wave of shock washed over the 500 guests. They turned their gazes toward me, their eyes wide with newfound reverence. I was no longer the quiet, supportive wife. I was the architect of a financial revolution. And Derek Donovan added, leaning closer to the microphone, "Federal agents are currently waiting for you in the main lobby. They have a warrant for your arrest regarding the embezzlement and the forged federal documents. I highly suggest you do not keep them waiting." The remaining scraps of Derek's sanity shattered. The absolute finality of his destruction broke him. He scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage, and pointed a trembling finger at Camille, who was still struggling against the police officers at the back of the room. "This is your fault!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You made me do this, Camille! You wanted the house! You wanted the money! You ruined my life!" Camille shrieked back at him, her mascara-stained face twisted in sheer panic as the officers dragged her through the mahogany doors. "You lied to me, Derek. You told me you had it all handled. You are a complete fraud." At the VIP table, Vivian finally comprehended the absolute totality of her ruin. The Alto Lake mansion was gone. Her son was going to federal prison. Her elite social standing had just been publicly incinerated. She let out a guttural, high-pitched wail and collapsed onto the marble floor, a weeping heap of discarded designer silk. The wealthy socialites she had desperately tried to impress simply stepped over her, adjusting their evening gowns and averting their eyes in sheer disgust. Terrence, seeing his mother collapse and his brother dragged away, realized he was entirely alone with a $100,000 fraudulent debt. He ducked his head and tried to sprint toward the kitchen exit. He did not make it far. Two men in dark suits stepped out from the service corridor, blocking his path. They were private process servers tipped off by my legal team earlier that afternoon. They shoved a thick stack of legal documents into Terrence's chest, cornering him against the wall as they loudly informed him of the impending breach of contract lawsuit. I watched the villains tear each other apart, tearing down the very illusions they had sacrificed everything to build. I turned to Donovan, offering him a single nod of mutual respect. We walked off the stage together, leaving the screaming and the crying behind us. The execution was complete. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled and the reality of their consequences was absolute. Derek was currently residing in a federal penitentiary, serving a lengthy sentence for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the forgery of federal documents. He had traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His arrogant smirk was permanently erased, replaced by the bleak reality of a concrete cell and the knowledge that he had absolutely nothing waiting for him on the outside. Camille was completely bankrupt. The legal fees required to fight her grand larceny and possession of stolen property charges had drained every single penny she possessed. She lost her luxury apartment, her designer wardrobe, and her entire social circle. She was currently awaiting trial, working a grueling minimum wage retail job just to afford a public defender. Vivian and Terrence had suffered the most poetic justice of all. Completely cut off from my financial oxygen supply, they were forced to vacate their upscale lifestyle. They now lived together in a cramped, run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of Atlanta. Vivian was a total social pariah. She had tried to call her old sorority sisters and country club acquaintances, but her number was universally blocked. She spent her days sitting in a dingy living room mourning the empire she never actually owned. Terrence, severely burdened by the massive default penalties and legal judgments from his fraudulent commercial lease, was forced to work grueling double shifts at a local car wash. His dreams of being a luxury automotive titan had dissolved into minimum wage scrubbing and endless debt collection calls. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. I stood in my immaculate corner office on the 40th floor of the Aegis Financial Technologies Tower. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The afternoon sun bathed the city in brilliant golden light, reflecting off the skyscrapers and the bustling streets below. The door to my office opened and Donovan walked in carrying a leather portfolio. We were no longer just strategic allies. We were equal partners in the most powerful financial technology venture in the Southeast. My holding company's exclusive licensing agreement with Sterling Capital had generated unprecedented profits for both of our firms. We reviewed the quarterly projections together, operating with a seamless mutual respect that Derek could never have comprehended. I signed the final authorization forms, handing the portfolio back to Donovan. He offered a sharp, satisfied smile and exited the room, leaving me alone with the spectacular view of my empire. I walked to the edge of the glass, resting my fingertips against the cool surface. I was the undisputed queen of my domain. I had built this world with my own intellect, my own unseen labor, and my own sheer will. I had allowed parasites to feast at my table for a decade, but I had also possessed the power to permanently close the doors. They called me cold. But in this world, the most elegant revenge isn't destroying someone, it's taking back exactly what is yours and letting them drown in their own greed.